The sun bled gold and crimson over the endless savanna, a quiet witness to centuries of change, struggle, and resilience. Before Shaka Zulu etched his name in history, the land pulsed with the rhythms of countless lives, each beating to its own drum. Tall grass swayed in time with the chants of warriors, and ancient rivers whispered stories to the winds. This was a land where kingdoms rose like storms and vanished like whispers, where power shifted with the tide of human ambition, and survival was a game of strength and cunning. The southern tip of Africa had always been a place of immense complexity. Here, in this vast and fertile land, families grew into clans, clans into tribes, and tribes into powerful kingdoms. Each carried the weight of its traditions, its gods, and its unbroken ties to the earth. The Nguni people, ancestors of the Zulu, were no different. They spoke in voices shaped by the wind and rain, their words heavy with meaning, their eyes forever scanning the horizon for threats or blessings. Among these tribes was a small clan called the Zulu. They were not the strongest, not the largest, and certainly not the wealthiest. Their cattle, the measure of prosperity, grazed in modest numbers. Their warriors were brave but few. Yet, even in their smallness, they carried something indestructible, a spark that would one day ignite an inferno. In those days, the land was a mosaic of competing powers. The Ndwandwe, led by their fierce chief Zwide, spread fear with their raids, their warriors moving like shadows across the veldt. To the south, the Mthethwa, under the wise and ambitious Dingiswayo, gathered strength, their influence stretching like roots through the soil. Between them, countless other clans lived and fought, their stories entwined like threads in a vast tapestry. Life was precarious. Rainfall dictated survival, a good season meant food and peace, while drought brought hunger and war. The Nguni people held the land sacred, each rock and tree a reminder of their ancestors. But this reverence did not soften their resolve. They fought with spears forged in fire and strategies honed by centuries of conflict. In the midst of this chaotic beauty, the Zulu people lived, humble and overlooked. Their leader, Senzangakona, was not a man of great ambition. He ruled with a steady hand, but did not seek to expand his borders. His people farmed their land, herded their cattle, and honored the spirits of their forebears. The Zulu knew their place in the larger scheme of things, and they were content, or so it seemed. But the winds of change were stirring. The land, alive and breathing, seemed to sense it. Trees whispered of it in the rustle of their leaves. Fires crackled with stories of coming storms. Among the Nguni, survival demanded constant vigilance, and the Zulu were no exception. They trained their young men in the art of war, their chants rising with the morning mist. Mothers sang lullabies of bravery to their children, their voices soft yet unyielding. The land was alive with possibility and peril. Every tribe watched their neighbors with wary eyes, alliances forming and breaking like waves on the shore. The Zulu, small as they were, began to notice the shifting sands. Whispers traveled faster than rivers, and the name Dingiswayo became a chant on the wind. His vision was unlike any seen before. He sought unity, not through love, but through power. He saw potential where others saw chaos. The Zulu people, like all others, felt the weight of their precarious existence. Life was a constant negotiation with the elements and with other clans. Each dawn brought the promise of either peace or bloodshed. Cattle herders walked their fields with spears in hand, their eyes scanning the horizon. Women worked tirelessly, their hands strong and calloused, their hearts steady with the knowledge that every day was a gift. As the larger tribes consolidated power, the Zulu remained unnoticed, their smallness their shield. But their spirit was unbreakable. Among them were young warriors who dreamed of greatness, whose hands itched to hold the spears of victory. They were not content with obscurity. They were restless, and the land itself seemed to hum with the tension of what was to come. This was a world on the edge of transformation. The air buzzed with the energy of something unseen, something inevitable. The Zulu were still small, still humble, but they were no longer invisible. Their name would soon be spoken in awe and fear, their legacy written not in ink but in blood and courage. And then came Shaka. The sky hung heavy with the weight of storms, as if the earth itself was bracing for something extraordinary. Clouds rolled across the heavens, thick and dark, there rumbled a distant heartbeat. Beneath them, a young woman stood tall, her gaze fierce and unyielding. Nandi was not like the others. There was a fire in her eyes that refused to dim, even in the face of whispers that followed her every step. She was beautiful, but it was not her beauty that drew attention, it was her spirit. She carried herself with a strength that defied expectation, a quiet defiance that rippled through her like the wind over tall grass. When Senzangakona, the chief of the Zulu, first saw her, he was struck not just by her presence, but by the power she held within her slender frame. She was no mere woman, she was a storm wrapped in flesh. Their union was not one of equals, though. Senzangakona, a man used to power and control, did not expect the kind of challenge Nandi presented. She did not bend easily, and this intrigued him, frustrated him, and, ultimately, drew him closer. But what began as intrigue would soon unravel into something far more complicated. When Nandi bore his child, the earth seemed to pause. The birth of a child in any clan was a moment of joy, a celebration of life continuing against all odds. But this child's birth carried a shadow. The circumstances were far from ideal. Some whispered that it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment by the great chief. Others claimed the child was marked for greatness, born under a sky that split open with lightning, as if the heavens themselves had declared his arrival. Nandi named him Shaka. The name itself was a rebellion, a statement that this boy would not be ordinary. But from the moment he drew his first breath, Shaka's life was marked by struggle. Senzangakona, despite the connection he once felt with Nandi, refused to acknowledge the child as legitimate. It was an insult that cut deep, a wound that festered in Nandi's heart. But she was not one to bow to humiliation. As Shaka grew, so did the challenges. Nandi, cast aside and shamed, became a force of unyielding love and determination. She shielded her son from the world's harshness, but not from its truths. She taught him that life would not be kind, that respect was not given freely but taken through strength and will. Her words were a fire that burned in his young heart, shaping the boy into something sharper, something stronger. The boy himself was unlike others. Even as a child, there was a presence about him that made people pause. His eyes, deep and piercing, seemed to see more than they should. Elders would mutter under their breath about omens and destiny, their words carrying both fear and hope. Shaka was no ordinary child, they said, and this was both a blessing and a curse. But blessings did not shield him from the cruelties of the world. Other children mocked him, their taunts like sharp stones thrown in malice. Fatherless, they called him, a word meant to strip him of dignity. He did not cry, he did not run. Instead, he stood taller, his young fists clenched at his sides, his jaw set with a resolve far beyond his years. Nandi watched from the shadows, her heart aching but swelling with pride. Her son would not break. One story of Shaka's childhood lingered in the air, retold with awe and shivers. It was said that during a great storm, when thunder roared and the sky was a churning sea of black, Shaka stood outside, unafraid. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his small frame, and the winds howled around him as if speaking directly to the boy. He did not flinch. He stood as if claiming the storm itself, as if daring the heavens to strike him down. The elders whispered of prophecies. A child born amidst strife, a boy whose life would be forged in fire and sharpened by the steel of hardship. They said the ancestors spoke of a leader who would rise not from privilege but from pain, a warrior who would unite the fractured clans and carve a name into history. Was this child the one? But prophecies, as powerful as they were, did not soften the edges of reality. Life was relentless. Nandi and Shaka were forced to leave the Zulu clan, their departure marked by shame and rejection. They wandered, finding refuge among other tribes, but never truly finding peace. For Nandi, it was a betrayal she could not forgive. For Shaka, it was a lesson he would never forget. The boy grew into a young man, his frame lean but powerful, his spirit forged in the fires of rejection and resilience. He learned to fight not just with his fists, but with his mind. Every hardship became a lesson, every insult a spark that fueled his drive. Nandi's teachings were his foundation, her love a shield against the darkness of the world. There was a moment, small, almost insignificant in its simplicity, that spoke volumes about who Shaka was becoming. A lion had been sighted near the grazing fields, and panic rippled through the clan. Shaka, barely a teenager, picked up a spear and walked into the bush. He returned hours later, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes burning with triumph. In his hands was the broken spear, and behind him, the lifeless body of the lion. The clan watched in stunned silence. He was no longer just a boy. He was something else entirely, a force that could not be contained. And yet, this was only the beginning. The sun was merciless that day, scorching the earth as if it too bore witness to the weight of injustice. Nandi stood at the edge of the Zulu lands, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Her grip on young Shaka's hand was firm, a lifeline for both mother and son. Behind them, whispers filled the air, cruel, cutting words carried by the wind, spoken by those who had turned their backs on them. They were outcasts now, stripped of their place, their dignity, their belonging. Nandi's heart burned with a fury that words could not contain, but she held her silence. For her, there was no room for weakness, not with Shaka standing beside her, his young face already hardened by the sting of betrayal. Exile was not just a removal, it was a sentence. The world outside their tribe was a cruel one, and survival would demand everything they had. The first night in the wilderness was bitterly cold, the stars shining down like indifferent witnesses. Nandi gathered what scraps of grass she could find to soften the hard ground for Shaka, her hands trembling but determined. He watched her, his eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, a silent promise to never forget. The days turned into weeks, and each step took them farther from the place they once called home. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, a relentless ache that neither could ignore. Nandi foraged what she could, her sharp eyes scanning the land for wild fruits or edible roots. Shaka followed her lead, learning to read the signs of the earth, the whispers of the animals, the patterns of the wind. But hunger was not the only threat. Other tribes watched the pair with suspicion, their gazes heavy with mistrust. Strangers were often treated as enemies, and Nandi knew they would find no welcome here. Still, she approached each new settlement with her head held high, her voice steady as she pleaded for work, for food, for a chance. Some turned them away with disdain, others offered scraps, enough to keep them alive, but barely. Through it all, Shaka absorbed the world around him. He saw how the strong ruled the weak, how power demanded respect, how survival was a game of strategy and will. He watched his mother fight every day, her pride a shield against the world's scorn. She never let him see her cry, but in the dead of night, when she thought he was asleep, her soft sobs filled the darkness. Shaka lay still, his fists clenched, his heart vowing to one day erase the pain etched into her face. There was a moment that lingered in Shaka's mind, a memory that burned brighter than the rest. They had found temporary refuge in a neighboring kingdom, working as servants in exchange for food. One evening, as they returned from the fields, a group of older boys blocked their path. They mocked Shaka, calling him names that echoed his father's rejection. They pushed him, laughed at his anger, and dared him to fight back. But Shaka didn't fight. Not then. Nandi's voice rang in his ears, "Your time will come, but it is not now." He swallowed his pride, his anger simmering beneath the surface. That night, as he lay under the thin blanket they shared, he whispered to himself, "One day, they will know my name." The years passed, and the boy grew. Shaka's body, once lean and wiry, became strong and imposing. Hardship had sculpted him, each challenge a chisel shaping his resolve. He learned to use a spear, practicing with sticks until his hands bled. He studied the warriors he encountered, watching their movements, their tactics, their weaknesses. Every humiliation, every insult, became fuel for the fire that burned within him. But it was not just strength that Shaka gained. Nandi, ever his teacher, instilled in him a sense of purpose. "You are more than what they say," she told him one evening as they sat by a dwindling fire. "Greatness is born in the furnace of suffering." Her words stayed with him, a constant reminder that his pain was not meaningless, it was a forge, and he was the blade being tempered. One night, the rains came, a torrential downpour that soaked the earth and their meager shelter. Nandi and Shaka huddled together, the sound of the storm drowning out the world. Shaka, now a young man, felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He looked at his mother, her face lined with exhaustion, but still beautiful, still proud. "I will make this right," he said, his voice steady and fierce. Nandi didn't reply, but her hand rested on his arm, her touch saying more than words ever could. Their exile was not just a time of survival, it was a crucible. Shaka emerged from it changed, his mind sharpened, his spirit unbroken. The world had tried to crush him, but it had only made him stronger. Every step he took brought him closer to the man he was meant to become. And somewhere, in the distance, the winds began to shift. The veld was quiet that evening, a silence that stretched and hummed with anticipation. Shaka, barely a boy, stood alone among the tall grass. The sky above him was a canvas of bruised purple and gold, and the distant mountains loomed like sleeping giants. He held a makeshift spear in his hands, the wood worn smooth from hours of practice. His breath was steady, his eyes unblinking as they scanned the horizon. He had been sent to herd the cattle, a duty as ordinary as the rising sun. But this day had brought more than routine. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of a lion prowling nearby, a shadow that moved through the bush with lethal grace. Shaka's heartbeat quickened, but he did not call for help. He did not run. Instead, he crouched low, his bare feet pressing into the earth, his muscles coiled like springs. When the lion emerged, it was as if the earth itself had exhaled. The beast was enormous, its golden mane catching the last rays of sunlight, its eyes gleaming with a primal hunger. The cattle scattered, their panicked cries tearing through the stillness. But Shaka did not flinch. He rose slowly, the spear firm in his grip, his gaze locked on the predator. What happened next became legend. Some say the boy stood his ground, his voice rising in a chant that stilled the lion's advance. Others claim he threw his spear with such precision that the beast fled, wounded and roaring. Whatever the truth, Shaka returned to the village alone, his face calm, his spear intact. The cattle followed him, as if drawn by an invisible force. The story spread like wildfire, and the whispers began, this boy was no ordinary child. It was not the only tale of its kind. The people spoke of Shaka's uncanny ability to outthink his foes, human or otherwise. There was the time he faced a wild boar, its tusks gleaming like daggers as it charged. Shaka had no weapon, only his wits. He lured the beast toward a ravine, leading it into a trap of its own making. The boar plunged into the depths, its furious cries echoing as Shaka stood above, unscathed. Even the elders, who had seen much in their lifetimes, were struck by the boy's ingenuity. They spoke of how he observed the world with a sharpness that others lacked, how he noticed patterns in the way animals moved, the way the wind shifted before a storm. He was a child of the earth, they said, and the earth seemed to favor him in return. But Shaka's resilience was not limited to his encounters with nature. There was the tale of the thorn bush, a story told in hushed tones around evening fires. One day, while playing with other boys, Shaka stumbled into a dense thicket, its branches armed with vicious thorns. The other children laughed, their voices mocking as he struggled to free himself. Blood stained his legs and arms, the pain sharp and unrelenting. Yet Shaka did not cry out. He worked silently, methodically, snapping each branch with calculated force until he emerged, scratched and bleeding but triumphant. He stood before his tormentors, his face a mask of quiet defiance, and the laughter died on their lips. From that day forward, the other boys treated him with a wary respect. The elders claimed that even the animals sensed Shaka's presence, that they regarded him not as prey but as an equal. Hunters returning from the bush told stories of a young boy who moved like a shadow, his footsteps silent, his eyes unblinking as he tracked the movements of leopards and hyenas. They said he could mimic the calls of birds and knew the language of the wind. One story, perhaps the most haunting of all, spoke of a time when Shaka encountered a snake, a massive black mamba coiled among the rocks. The venomous serpent lifted its head, its hood flaring as it hissed, its fangs gleaming like ivory. Most would have fled, but Shaka stood still, his body taut with readiness. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand, his movements so precise that the snake hesitated, its strike held at bay. What happened next remains a mystery. Some say Shaka spoke to the snake in a language only they could understand. Others claim the boy's courage alone subdued the deadly creature. What is certain is that when the other children arrived, drawn by the commotion, they found Shaka standing unharmed, the snake slithering away into the grass. These stories were more than entertainment, they were proof of something extraordinary. Shaka was not just surviving, he was thriving, even in the face of danger and hardship. His intelligence was a weapon, his resilience a shield. The hardships of his life did not break him, they forged him, each trial adding another layer of steel to his spirit. And though he was still a boy, those who knew him could feel it, that unshakable sense of inevitability. He was destined for more than this, more than the small fires and narrow horizons of their daily lives. Somewhere, far beyond the reach of the stories and whispers, the winds carried his name, a faint echo of what was to come. The battlefield was alive with chaos. The clash of spears and shields, the guttural cries of warriors, the pounding of feet against the earth, it was a symphony of survival, brutal and unrelenting. Shaka stood at the edge of it all, his eyes scanning the fray with the precision of a hawk. In his hand, he held a weapon unlike any other, its blade gleaming in the sun, its weight a perfect extension of his arm. This was no ordinary spear. The warriors around him carried long, throwing spears, weapons designed to be hurled from a distance. But Shaka had seen the flaws in this. A thrown spear left a man defenseless, his reach extended only for a moment before the weapon left his grasp. It was an act of finality, a gamble of desperation. Shaka wanted more. His weapon, the Iklewa, was born not from desperation but from strategy. It was shorter, sturdier, with a broad blade designed for stabbing rather than throwing. The name itself carried the sound of its purpose, Iklewa, the wet, guttural noise it made as it was pulled from flesh. In Shaka's hands, it was not just a tool but a promise, a symbol of a new kind of warfare. The idea had come to him in the stillness of the night, when the silence carried the weight of unsaid truths. He had studied the old ways, watched the warriors throw their spears and rush into combat with shields raised but hands empty. It was a dance that left too much to chance, too much to the whims of distance and luck. Shaka knew there had to be another way. When he first presented the Iklewa to his warriors, there was skepticism, even resistance. The Zulu people held their traditions close, and the long-throwing spear had been their companion for generations. But Shaka's conviction was unshakable. He demonstrated its use with the fervor of a prophet, showing how the shorter spear allowed for swift, lethal strikes in close combat. He paired it with a new style of fighting, one that demanded discipline, precision, and the courage to face an enemy head-on. The warriors began to see the change almost immediately. On the battlefield, the Iklewa transformed them from a scattered force into a unified machine. They moved as one, their shields locked together, their spears striking like the fangs of a serpent. The long, chaotic arcs of thrown weapons were replaced with the brutal efficiency of stabbing thrusts. But the Iklewa was more than a weapon, it was a symbol. In Zulu culture, a spear was not just a piece of iron and wood, it was an extension of the warrior's soul. It carried his spirit, his strength, his identity. To carry a spear was to carry the weight of one's ancestors, to honor the bloodline that had endured through countless battles. Shaka understood this deeply. When he crafted the Iklewa, he imbued it with a sense of purpose that resonated beyond the physical. Each blade was forged not only with fire and hammer but with intention. He insisted that his warriors see the spear not as a tool of destruction but as a beacon of what they could become. He spoke of the Iklewa with reverence, his words igniting the hearts of his people. "This is not just a weapon," he said one night as the warriors gathered around the fire. "This is a promise, to yourself, to your family, to your tribe. With this in your hand, you are not alone. You carry the strength of those who came before you and the hope of those who will come after." The warriors listened, their faces lit by the flickering flames, their hands resting on the hilts of their spears. In that moment, the Ikilwa became more than a blade, it became a bond, a shared belief in something greater than themselves. Shaka's innovations extended beyond the weapon itself. He introduced new tactics, training his warriors to move as a single unit, their shields overlapping like the scales of a great beast. The Ikilwa allowed them to fight in tighter formations, to press forward with an intensity that overwhelmed their enemies. It was a style of combat that demanded not only physical strength but mental fortitude. On the battlefield, Shaka's warriors became a force of nature. The Ikilwa flashed in the sun, its blade striking with deadly precision. The sound of shields slamming together, the rhythmic chanting of the warriors, the sheer power of their advance, it was a sight that inspired awe and terror in equal measure. But the true power of the Ikilwa lay in its ability to transform those who wielded it. It was not merely a weapon of war, it was a catalyst for change, a reminder that strength came not from tradition alone but from the courage to challenge it. Shaka's vision was one of evolution, of taking what was and shaping it into what could be. As the sun set on another victorious day, Shaka stood among his warriors, the Ikilwa resting in his hand. He looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in hues of crimson and gold. The battlefield was silent now, the echoes of combat fading into the earth. In his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. And somewhere, in the gathering shadows, the future awaited. The night sky stretched endlessly, a canopy of stars shimmering like scattered diamonds. Shaka sat by the fire, his silhouette etched against the flames. Across from him, a figure loomed, Chief Dingiswayo of the Mthethwa, a man whose presence was as commanding as the mountains themselves. The air between them was thick with unspoken understanding, a bridge built not of words but of shared ambition and vision. Dingiswayo steadied the young man before him, his eyes sharp, discerning. He saw in Shaka something rare, a spark that could ignite an entire nation. Yet, he also saw Uranus, a blade untempered by the heat of experience. Strength without strategy, Dingiswayo finally said, his voice measured, is like a river without banks. It floods, it rages, but it leaves no path. Those words struck Shaka deeply. He had always known the value of power, of force, but here was a man who spoke of something greater, of control, discipline, purpose. It was a lesson Shaka would carry with him, shaping not just the warrior but the leader he was destined to become. Under Dingiswayo's mentorship, Shaka found not only guidance but validation. For years, he had felt like an outcast, his brilliance overshadowed by the weight of exile and ridicule. But Dingiswayo saw him, truly saw him, and in doing so, gave him the space to grow. The Mthethwa were a formidable force, their warriors disciplined, their strategies refined. Dingiswayo's leadership was not built on fear, but on loyalty, a loyalty earned through fairness and wisdom. Shaka observed this with keen interest, noting how the chief inspired devotion without raising his voice, how he led not from behind but alongside his men. One day, Dingiswayo summoned Shaka to accompany him on a military campaign. The young warrior watched as the Mthethwa forces moved with precision, their formations tight, their movements seamless. It was not the chaos of battle that Shaka had known, but a symphony of strategy, each warrior playing his part to perfection. Shaka's mind raced as he absorbed every detail. He saw how Dingiswayo used terrain to his advantage, how he read the enemy's weaknesses like an open book. He realized that war was not just about strength, but about understanding your enemy, your people, and yourself. It was during one of these campaigns that Shaka first put his own ideas into practice. Dingiswayo, ever the mentor, allowed him to command a small contingent of warriors. Shaka introduced a tighter formation, instructing his men to lock their shields and advance as one, the Ikilwa in their hands poised for swift, decisive strikes. The results were electrifying. The enemy, expecting the usual disarray of tribal skirmishes, found themselves overwhelmed by the relentless, unified force. When the dust settled, Dingiswayo approached Shaka, a rare smile playing on his lips. "You have the mind of a leader," he said simply. For Shaka, those words were more valuable than gold. But Dingiswayo's mentorship extended beyond the battlefield. He spoke to Shaka about the importance of alliances, of weaving together a network of loyalty and respect. He explained that true power lay not in domination but in unity, in bringing together disparate clans under a shared vision. Shaka listened intently, his mind a whirlwind of ideas. He began to see the Zulu not as a single tribe, but as the nucleus of something far greater. He envisioned a kingdom, a force that could stand unshaken against any foe. And in Dingiswayo, he found not only a mentor but a kindred spirit, someone who believed in the possibility of transformation. One evening, as the fire crackled and the stars watched silently, Dingiswayo shared a story from his youth. He spoke of a time when he, too, had been uncertain, when the weight of leadership had felt unbearable. But doubt, he said, is a gift. It keeps you searching, questioning. Never let it paralyze you. Use it. Shaka carried those words with him, repeating them in his mind during moments of uncertainty. He began to see doubt not as a weakness but as a catalyst for growth. Yet, even as Dingiswayo nurtured Shaka's potential, he was acutely aware of the storm that brewed within the young warrior. Shaka's ambition was fierce, his hunger for greatness insatiable. Dingiswayo saw the fire in his eyes, the unyielding determination that bordered on ruthlessness. He admired it, but he also feared it, knowing that such a flame could consume as easily as it could illuminate. The bond between them was complex, a mix of respect, admiration, and an unspoken acknowledgement of their differences. Dingiswayo was a leader who sought harmony, who believed in the power of unity through understanding. Shaka, for all his brilliance, was a force of nature, unrelenting and uncompromising. Their time together was transformative, shaping Shaka in ways he could never have imagined. Dingiswayo's teachings were the foundation upon which Shaka would build his empire, a blueprint for greatness tempered by his own fierce will. But even as the lessons unfolded, there was a sense of inevitability, a feeling that their paths, though intertwined, would one day diverge. Somewhere in the distance, the drumbeats of destiny grew louder, their rhythm steady and unrelenting. The fire crackled, its embers rising like whispers into the night sky. Around it sat the Sangomas, their eyes half closed, their bodies swaying to a rhythm only they could hear. The smell of burning herbs filled the air, a heady, intoxicating blend that seemed to pull the earth and sky closer together. In the glow of the flames, their faces were painted with shadows, as if they were neither here nor there, caught between the tangible world and the vast unknown. Shaka stood at the edge of the circle, his body still but his heart pounding. He had always regarded the Sangomas with a mix of awe and wariness. These were not ordinary men and women, they were the keepers of mysteries, the voices of the ancestors. Their words carried weight, shaping the lives of those who dared to listen. One of them, an elder with a face etched by time, rose slowly. Her staff thudded against the ground, the sound resonating like a heartbeat. She turned toward Shaka, her eyes piercing through the darkness as if she could see straight into his soul. "You," she said, her voice like the rustling of leaves in a storm. "The ancestors speak of you." The air grew heavier, the fire dimming as if the world itself was holding its breath. Shaka felt the weight of her words, the way they wrapped around him like a shroud. He wanted to speak, to ask what they meant, but the words caught in his throat. The Sangoma began to chant, her voice rising and falling like the waves of the ocean. The others joined in, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of sound. Shaka could feel it pulling at him, dragging him into something vast and incomprehensible. Suddenly, she stopped. The silence was deafening. She pointed her staff at Shaka, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You will not walk the path of ordinary men," she said. "You will unite the fractured. You will turn chaos into order. But the blood of the land will stain your feet, and the cries of the ancestors will follow you." Her words struck like lightning, illuminating truths he had never dared to consider. Shaka felt a chill run through him, his mind reeling. Unite the fractured? Turn chaos into order? It was a destiny both intoxicating and terrifying. The Sangoma spoke of visions, of a great shield spreading over the land, of warriors moving as one, of a king whose name would echo for generations. They saw him standing atop a mountain, his spear raised high, the land below him stretching far and wide. But they also saw shadows, of betrayal, of loss, of a river of tears that would flow long after his time. These prophecies were not simply predictions, they were declarations, etched into the fabric of existence. The Sangomas were not offering choices, they were revealing inevitabilities. Shaka felt the weight of it pressing down on him, the enormity of what lay ahead. In the days that followed, he could not shake their words. They clung to him like a second skin, shaping his thoughts, his actions. He began to see the world differently, to understand that his life was not his own, but part of something far greater. The Sangomas continued to guide him, their rituals and chants weaving a thread between the present and the past. They taught him to listen, not with his ears, but with his spirit. They spoke of the ancestors, of their whispers carried on the wind, their guidance found in the patterns of the stars. One night, as the fire burned low, a younger Sangoma approached him. Her eyes were bright, her voice steady. "The ancestors say you are the spear and the shield," she told him. "You will protect, but you will also pierce. Do you understand?" Shaka nodded, though he wasn't sure if he truly did. The words felt right, even if their full meaning eluded him. He began to embrace the role the Sangomas had foretold. He saw the divisions among the tribes, the way they fought not just their enemies, but each other. He understood that unity was not just a dream, but a necessity. And yet, he also knew that unity came with a price he was willing to pay. The Sangomas continued their rituals, their chants echoing in his mind long after the fires had died. They spoke of a path lined with thorns, of choices that would break his heart even as they strengthened his people. They warned him that greatness was a lonely road, that the crown he would wear would weigh heavy. But Shaka was unyielding. He had heard the voices of the ancestors, felt their presence in the stillness of the night. He knew that his destiny was not one he could escape, even if he had wanted to. The visions of the Sangomas stayed with him, guiding him in ways he couldn't fully explain. He carried their words like a talisman, a reminder that he was more than just a man, he was a force, a promise, a prophecy in motion. And as the horizon began to glow with the first light of dawn, Shaka stood tall, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. Somewhere in the distance, the drumbeats of war echoed faintly, growing louder with each passing moment. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Shaka stood alone at the edge of the camp, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The faint glow of the moon painted his face in silver, but his expression was carved from stone. There was a fire within him, a restless blaze that refused to be quenched. He could feel it in his chest, an unrelenting drumbeat, a call he could no longer ignore. The blood of Senzangakona coursed through his veins, a lineage both a curse and a command. It whispered to him in his dreams, haunted him in waking moments. He had been cast aside, humiliated, stripped of his place. But now, the same blood that had marked him an outcast demanded that he rise. The faces of his childhood swirled in his memory, those who had sneered, those who had laughed, those who had looked away when he needed them most. Their voices echoed in his mind, taunting him, daring him to forget what he was owed. But he remembered. He remembered everything. Shaka's fists clenched at his sides as he thought of Senzangakona's other sons, those who now sat on the throne that was rightfully his. Weak, complacent, blind to the potential of their people. They ruled not with strength but with entitlement, squandering the legacy of their father. The time had come. Shaka turned back toward the camp, where his warriors lay resting. They were not yet many, but they were fierce. Each one of them had pledged their loyalty, drawn not by promises of wealth or power, but by the force of Shaka's will. He had trained them relentlessly, shaping them into a weapon unlike anything the Zulu had seen before. Discipline, precision, unity, these were his commandments. He could see them in his mind's eye, their shields locked, their spears poised. He had taught them not just how to fight, but how to think, how to anticipate, how to move as one. They were more than warriors, they were a storm waiting to be unleashed. And he would lead them. Shaka knew that reclaiming his birthright would not be easy. The clans were fragmented, each jealously guarding its own interests. But he also knew that there was a hunger among the people, a yearning for something greater. They were tired of the endless squabbles, the petty rivalries that left them vulnerable to outside forces. He would be the answer to their unspoken prayers. The Sangomas had seen it, their visions filled with shields and blood, with a leader who would rise from the ashes of division. Shaka had felt the weight of their prophecies, and now he was ready to fulfill them. But this was no act of destiny alone. This was his will, his determination, his refusal to be denied. In the quiet moments, when the camp was still and the stars watched from above, Shaka would sit by the fire and let his thoughts run wild. He imagined the faces of his enemies, the ones who would stand against him. He could feel their fear, their uncertainty. He would use it against them, turning their hesitation into his advantage. But he also thought of his people, the ones who had suffered, who had been trampled underfoot by stronger tribes. He thought of the children who would grow up knowing only fear, the women who would mourn sons and brothers lost to endless conflict. For them, he would rise. Shaka began to send out envoys, his messages carried by those who believed in his vision. He spoke of unity, of strength, of a Zulu kingdom that would no longer bow to anyone. He called on the disillusioned, the ambitious, the brave. Slowly, they came to him, men and women from different clans, drawn by the promise of something greater than themselves. He welcomed them, but he did not coddle them. They trained as his warriors did, their bodies pushed to the brink, their minds sharpened like blades. Shaka demanded excellence, and they gave it willingly. The nights grew colder, the winds harsher, but Shaka's resolve only hardened. He knew that the time was near, that the first strike would set the tone for everything that followed. He had to be decisive, unrelenting. There could be no room for doubt. As the first light of dawn broke over the hills, Shaka stood before his gathered warriors. Their faces were hard, their eyes alight with the same fire that burned within him. He spoke to them not as a king but as one of them, his voice steady and clear. "This is our time," he said, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. "No one will give us what is ours. We will take it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing louder, stronger, until it became a roar. Shaka felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, not from the earth, but from the sheer force of their will. He raised his spear, the tip gleaming in the rising sun. Somewhere beyond the hills, his enemies stirred, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. Shaka smiled, a sharp, fierce smile that carried no mirth. The call of blood was deafening now, a tide that could not be turned back. It was not just a call to war, but a call to destiny, a call to rise and reclaim what had been stolen. The horizon stretched before him, vast and unyielding, but Shaka saw it for what it was, a challenge waiting to be met. And he would meet it, with fire in his heart and steel in his hand. The sun was setting over the Zulu lands, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and gold. Shadows stretched long and thin across the rolling hills, as if the earth itself held its breath. A figure moved through the landscape, tall and unyielding, his steps measured but firm. Shaka had returned. He had not come as the outcast boy they once dismissed, nor as the warrior forged in exile. He returned as something more, an unrelenting force, a storm cloaked in flesh. The air around him seemed to hum with anticipation, every glance, every gesture charged with an energy that commanded attention. The Zulu lands were familiar yet changed. Villages clung to tradition but bore the scars of division. Elders whispered of hard times, of leadership grown stale and ambitions dulled by comfort. It was a land waiting for a spark, and Shaka knew he would be that fire. Word of his return spread quickly, carried on the lips of those who had once jeered at his name. But now, their tones were different. All mingled with fear, as tales of his victories under Dingiswayo reached the ears of even the most skeptical. They spoke of his cunning, his strength, and the warriors who marched in perfect rhythm at his side. When Shaka entered his father's kraal, the weight of years seemed to lift from his shoulders. This was where it had all begun, the place where he was born, where his mother had fought for him, where he had been cast aside. Now, he was back to rewrite the story, to carve his name into the bones of history. Senzangakona was long gone, his throne occupied by others unworthy of its power. They stood before Shaka now, his half-brothers, their faces a mixture of arrogance and unease. They had ruled through complacency, their power rooted in the fragile loyalties of a fractured clan. Shaka spoke, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. He did not ask for recognition, nor did he beg for support. He declared his intent, his words sharp and unflinching. This land will no longer be ruled by those who lack the strength to protect it, he said, his eyes locked on theirs. The Zulu will rise, not as scattered embers, but as a roaring fire. The council of elders listened, their expressions guarded but intrigued. They had seen rulers come and go, their promises as fleeting as the wind. But there was something different about Shaka, something undeniable. His words carried the weight of conviction, of someone who had faced the depths of despair and emerged unbroken. One by one, the warriors began to rally to his side. They came not out of obligation but out of belief in his vision, and his ability to lead them to a future unbound by the mistakes of the past. Shaka welcomed them, but he made no promises of ease. He demanded discipline, loyalty, and strength, and they gave it willingly. He began to reshape the clan from within, his reforms swift and bold. The warriors trained tirelessly, their movements precise and coordinated. Shaka's strategies were unlike anything the Zulu had known, blending the lessons of his time with Dingiswayo with his own innovations. The Ikawa became their symbol, a weapon that demanded close combat, that forced its wielder to face the enemy without hesitation. It was a weapon of courage, of commitment, and it mirrored the spirit of the man who wielded it first. Shaka's charisma was as much a weapon as his spear. He spoke to the people with a fire that ignited their hearts, his words weaving a vision of unity and strength. He reminded them of their shared lineage, of the blood that connected them, of the potential they held if only they would stand together. But his rise was not without resistance. There were those who clung to the old ways, who feared the change he represented. They plotted in shadows, whispering of rebellion, of stopping him before he could consolidate his power. Shaka faced them without flinching. He met defiance with resolve, rebellion with swift and decisive action. His victories were not just of the battlefield but of the spirit, breaking the chains of doubt that held his people back. As the days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, the transformation was undeniable. The Zulu were no longer a scattered clan, no longer a people defined by division. They moved as one, their strength growing with each passing day. And yet, Shaka's gaze was always on the horizon. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the consolidation of power was but a foundation for something greater. The echoes of prophecy lingered in his mind, a reminder of the unification that lay ahead. The fire of ambition burned brighter within him, fueled by the memories of his past, by the faces of those who had doubted him, by the cries of those who believed in him. The Zulu were rising, and the world would soon know their name. The night fell over the Zulu lands, the stars above a silent witness to the transformation unfolding below. In the stillness, Shaka stood once more at the edge of the kraal, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the fire. His thoughts were not of rest, but of the battles to come, of the victories that would solidify the foundation he had built. Beyond the hills, the winds carried whispers of other tribes, of other lands waiting to be brought into the fold. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a canvas waiting for his hand. And Shaka, with the fire in his heart and the steel in his hand, was ready. The air was thick with anticipation, the pulse of the land itself beating in time with the heavy drum. Every eye in the kraal was fixed on one man. The people were silent, as if holding their breath. The moment had come. Shaka stood at the center, his chest rising and falling with every measured breath. Today, he would claim what was his by right, by blood, by destiny. Today, the Zulu would have their king. It was a ceremony unlike any other, steeped in tradition yet charged with an energy that seemed to reach beyond the earth itself. The sky above, dark and clouded, held its own secret. There was something in the wind, something that hummed with power, as if the gods themselves were watching. No one dared speak, for there was something in the air, an electric charge that seemed to hang heavy over the crowd. Shaka stood tall, his gaze unwavering. His warriors surrounded him, their presence a living shield. The flames of the fire flickered, casting long shadows across the gathered masses. Everything was in place. The elders had gathered, the chants had begun, but there was something about this moment that felt larger than any ritual they had performed before. It was more than a coronation. It was a transformation, a moment that would forever change the course of history. The first omen came as a whisper in the wind, barely noticeable at first, but soon unmistakable. A lone bird, its feathers black as night, suddenly soared overhead. It flew high, circled above the crowd, and then, as if on cue, landed on the highest branch of a nearby tree. The people gasped. In their culture, birds were messengers of the gods. This bird, appearing just as Shaka prepared to step forward, was no mere coincidence. The omens were clear: a king was born, not by inheritance, but by fate. The flames of the fire grew stronger, as though in response to the bird's arrival. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain, the smell of change. The sky, once overcast and gloomy, suddenly parted, revealing the first sliver of a rising moon. The people watched, wide-eyed, as the clouds seemed to draw back, leaving the moon to shine directly upon Shaka. The light cast its shadow long across the ground, stretching like a giant's hand, reaching out to claim the kingdom. In that moment, the weight of the past seemed to fall away. Shaka was not just the son of Sinzangakona, not just a warrior forged in exile. He was something more, something the people had longed for, though they didn't yet know it. He was the unifier, the one who would bring the scattered Zulu tribes together and lead them to greatness. The drumbeat grew louder, more urgent. The elders began their chant, their voices rising in unison, reverberating through the ground beneath their feet. The words were ancient, filled with power, each one carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. Shaka closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the rhythm to wash over him, grounding him in the here and now. He felt the eyes of the people upon him, but he did not flinch. This was his moment, and nothing could take it away. The final omen arrived just as Shaka was about to take his place at the center of the ceremony. A sudden burst of wind swept through the kraal, strong enough to rattle the shields of the warriors standing guard. It whipped through the fire, sending embers into the night sky, scattering sparks like tiny stars. For a brief moment, everything seemed to pause. Even the wind itself held its breath, as if waiting for the earth to confirm what had already been written in the stars. And then, as though the heavens themselves had given their blessing, Shaka raised his hand, his fingers curling into a fist, and the drumbeat reached its peak. The warriors lifted their spears in unison, a sound like thunder crashing through the night. The land itself seemed to respond, the earth vibrating beneath their feet, as though acknowledging the rise of a new power. Shaka's eyes opened, and for the first time, he truly saw the people before him, not as subjects, not as followers, but as his own. His people. His responsibility. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders, and he felt it, deep in his bones. This was no longer just a quest for power. This was about something greater. This was about the future, about what he could give to the Zulu, what he could create from the ashes of the past. With a single step, Shaka moved forward, his chest out, his gaze unwavering. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, battles, betrayals. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he had been chosen, not by the elders, not by the tribe, but by the land itself. The Zulu had spoken, and they had chosen him. He reached the center of the kraal, where the sacred fire burned brighter than ever. The flames seemed to bow before him, their light growing in strength. The elders gathered around, their faces solemn, their eyes filled with respect. Shaka stood tall among them, a figure of strength and purpose. The ceremony continued in silence, the people's hearts beating in time with the drums. Shaka knelt before the elders, offering them his full allegiance. He was not just taking a throne. He was pledging himself to them, to the people, to the Zulu as a whole. In that moment, his destiny was sealed. The land had spoken, and he had heard its call. And then, just as the ceremony neared its end, another omen swept through the kraal, a sudden burst of light, bright enough to make the stars themselves seem dim in comparison. The people looked up in wonder, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to shimmer with something sacred. The gods had given their blessing. Shaka had been crowned not just a king, but a warrior king. A king with the heart of the people, the fire of a lion, and the vision of a leader who would take the Zulu to greatness. The drums faded, but the light of the fire remained, a beacon in the darkness. Shaka stood tall, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The future was unwritten, but the world could already feel the change. The Zulu were united, and under Shaka, they would rise. The earth rumbled beneath his feet, not with the tremors of an earthquake, but with the heartbeat of a nation being born. Shaka stood on the edge of a ridge, gazing over the land that had been divided for so long. The clans that had once fought against each other were now scattered before him, each one carrying its own pride, its own wounds, its own history. But all of that was about to change. His mind was sharp, his vision clear. He could feel it in the air, a charged energy, like the quiet before a storm. The whispers of the land had guided him, and now it was time to answer the call. The people, the scattered tribes, were ready. Ready for something greater. Something unifying. The sound of a horn echoed across the hills, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was the signal, the unmistakable call to action. The clans had assembled, each group hesitant, unsure. The divisions that had held them apart for generations could not be erased overnight. But Shaka's presence alone was a force, his reputation preceding him like a shadow. There were murmurs among the people, some hopeful, others fearful, but all were drawn to the weight of his command. They had seen his rise, felt the power in his every move. They knew he was a leader unlike any other, and now he would show them what true unity could bring. The first clan to meet Shaka's call arrived cautiously, but with respect. Their chief, once proud and strong, now approached with a mix of admiration and hesitation. The old ways were hard to break, and he wasn't sure whether the new king would crush him or invite him into something greater. Shaka's eyes never wavered. With a single, swift motion, he extended his arm in greeting, a symbol of peace, of strength, of a future where enemies could stand side by side. The chief hesitated for only a moment before clasping Shaka's arm, sealing an unspoken pact of trust. The message was clear. Shaka was not here to destroy. He was here to build. One by one, the other clans came forward, each chief faced with the same choice. They could either stand in the past, holding on to old grudges, or they could step into the future, into a shared destiny that was stronger than the divisions that had kept them apart. And one by one, they chose to follow him. The fire of unity spread like wildfire, flickering across the land, consuming everything in its path. Where there had once been countless clans fighting for their own survival, there was now the beginnings of something greater, a single people, bound by a shared vision. The Zulu identity was born, not from one man's will, but from the collective hopes of those who had come together to rise. Shaka's influence reached beyond just the chiefs. The people, the warriors, the farmers, the elders, all felt the pull of the new Zulu nation. The warriors who had once fought in isolation, each defending their own piece of the land, now stood side by side, their spears gleaming in the sunlight, their hearts beating as one. They were no longer just individual clansmen. They were Zulu. There was a unity that ran deeper than blood. It was in the land itself, in the bones of the earth, in the songs the women sang and the dances that followed. It was in the way the men held their heads high, no longer looking over their shoulders in fear, but forward, to a future that promised strength. It was in the children, who now had a name to carry with pride, a heritage to claim as their own. Shaka's vision was more than just military might, it was a new way of living, a new way of thinking. The Zulu nation was not simply a collection of clans that had been forced together. It was a family. A people bound by a common purpose, a shared dream. And Shaka, their leader, would guide them toward greatness. His name would echo through the ages, not just for his battles won or his conquests, but for the way he forged a people out of disparate tribes, welding them together with the fire of his spirit. As the Zulu grew stronger, so too did their identity. They became more than just a tribe. They became a force, a presence that could not be ignored. Other kingdoms and clans looked on in awe, some in fear, as Shaka Zulu began to dominate the land. But it was not just their power that made them formidable, it was their unity. The Zulu stood as one, unshakable, unbreakable. The unity of the Zulu people spread, a bond stronger than any weapon. It was not just the warriors who fought for the nation, but every man, woman, and child. The community became a single organism, each part supporting the other, each member knowing their place, their role, their worth. The strength of the Zulu nation did not come from the might of any one individual, but from the collective spirit of its people, bound together by the will of a king who had seen what they could become. But even as Shaka's influence grew, there was no time to rest. The work was not yet done. His eyes were always on the horizon, always looking ahead, always pushing his people to be more, to achieve more. He had created the Zulu nation, but now he would build an empire that would shake the very foundations of southern Africa. The sound of drums echoed once more, filling the air with the promise of what was yet to come. The Zulu were no longer just a name. They were a nation, a force to be reckoned with. And under Shaka's rule, they would rise, unstoppable and united, a people defined not just by the land they occupied, but by the blood that flowed in their veins and the dreams that burned in their hearts. The sun had barely risen when the sound of boots hitting the earth echoed across the fields. It was a sound that would soon be etched into the memories of all who heard it. The Zulu warriors, once disorganized and fragmented, now moved with a new purpose. Every footstep, every breath, every heartbeat was aligned with the rhythm of something far greater than themselves. This was no longer a group of men, each fighting for their own survival. This was the birth of a force. Shaka's vision for the Zulu army was clear. No longer would they fight as isolated warriors, each depending on his own strength and will. Now, they would fight as one, a single, unstoppable wave of power that would crush any enemy that stood in their way. They would become the MP. The transformation began slowly, with Shaka personally overseeing every aspect of his warriors' training. He had seen the chaos and inefficiency of traditional battle tactics, and he knew they had to be different if they were to rise to greatness. He knew that the power of the army would not lie in the might of one man, but in the unity and precision of the entire force. The warriors' training was relentless, each day beginning before the sun's first light. Shaka did not care for rest or comfort. It was discipline, strength, and strategy that he demanded. The men were forced to drill for hours, running across fields, practicing formations, and learning the art of war in ways they had never imagined. Sweat poured from their bodies, their muscles burned, but they endured. They knew that their king had a vision. And if they were to stand with him, they had to become more than just soldiers, they had to become warriors with a purpose. The changes Shaka implemented weren't just about physical strength. They were about creating a bond, a sense of brotherhood. Each warrior was linked to the man next to him, and that connection would be what kept them strong in battle. The old ways, the chaotic rush into war without coordination, were abandoned. Now, the Zulu warriors had discipline. They had focus. And above all, they had each other. Shaka's genius lay not only in the training of his men, but in the tactics he developed. He understood that a battle could be won not just by force, but by strategy. He knew that a well-timed strike could shatter an opponent's morale before the fight had even truly begun. And so, the bullhorn formation was born. It was a tactic that would change everything. The warriors, now organized into smaller units, would form a massive crescent-shaped formation on the battlefield. The outer edges were the horns, where the warriors would move in sweeping arcs, surrounding the enemy on both sides. The center, the heart of the bullhorn, was where the fiercest fighters were stationed. This core would hold the pressure, absorbing the blows of the enemy while the horns swept in from the sides, flanking and confusing the enemy. It was like the power of a great beast, closing in from all sides, squeezing its prey. The enemy wouldn't know where to strike, wouldn't know how to defend. By the time they realized the trap, it would be too late. The impi was relentless, and once the battle had begun, there was no turning back. But the impi was more than just a military strategy. It was a symbol of what Shaka had created. His men were no longer just fighters, they were an extension of his will. They were a representation of his vision. And with each battle won, that vision was becoming reality. The bullhorn formation became Shaka's signature, and it struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. They spoke of it in whispers, of how the Zulu warriors could appear from nowhere, surrounding them like the horns of a great bull, trapping them in a deadly grip. It was a strategy that was impossible to defeat, and the Zulu warriors who executed it were unstoppable. But even as Shaka's military genius shaped the army into a force of unparalleled power, there was another key element that made the impi so deadly: the weapons. Shaka had also redefined the armament of his warriors, forging new weapons that would enhance the effectiveness of the army's tactics. The famous Iklewa, a short stabbing spear, became the weapon of choice. It was perfect for close combat, allowing the warriors to strike with precision and force in the heat of battle. The Iklewa was an extension of the Zulu warrior himself. It was not just a tool for war, it was a symbol of the unyielding power of the impi. The warriors wielded it with skill, each thrust and jab a testament to their training, their unity, and their loyalty to Shaka's vision. The change in the Zulu army was undeniable. From the day Shaka took command, the warriors had transformed from a ragtag group of fighters into a well-oiled machine. They fought with precision, with discipline, with an unbreakable bond to one another and to their king. They were more than just an army, they were an embodiment of Shaka's strength, his will, his ambition. As Shaka watched his army grow stronger, his heart swelled with pride. He had created something that would change the course of history. The impi was not just an army, it was the foundation of his empire. It was the force that would bring every kingdom and tribe to its knees. It was the force that would make Shaka's name known far and wide. And yet, as he stood there, looking at his warriors lined up in perfect formation, there was no sense of victory in his heart, not yet. He knew that the challenges ahead would be great. But he also knew that the impi, the force he had forged with his own hands, was ready. Ready to strike. Ready to rise. The thunder of their march echoed through the hills as Shaka led his warriors to battle. His heart beat in time with the drums of war, and he knew that the world would never be the same again. The Zulu nation had been born, and with it, a new era of power had begun. The smoke from the fires curled into the night sky, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and something far darker. The Zulu warriors, fresh from the heat of battle, stood still in the silence that followed the storm of war. The land lay before them, stretching endlessly, waiting to be claimed. Shaka's eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the horizon. He had already seen this before, this path of conquest, the way it carved through the heart of the land, leaving villages, kingdoms, and even the strong lost in its wake. But this time, it was different. This time, his vision wasn't just of lands and riches, it was of something greater. Something more unshakable. The warriors around him were no longer the same men they had been when he first found them. They had become more than just an army, they had become a force of nature, as unstoppable as the storms that battered the earth. But Shaka knew that conquest was not just about bloodshed. It was about influence. It was about bending the world to his will, even when it was not through the sharp edge of a spear. The campaign began, not with an outcry of war, but with the subtle weaving of alliances. The Zulu Empire would not simply grow through violence, it would grow through cunning. Neighbors were approached with both charm and force, a delicate dance where the threat of war loomed close, yet peace was offered in exchange for loyalty. Shaka was masterful in his approach, understanding that while his army's power was undeniable, there was wisdom in forging connections that extended beyond the battlefield. The first signs of this new strategy came with the neighboring clans. They had heard the whispers of the Zulu king and his legendary warriors, but they had not yet felt the full force of Shaka's will. At first, they were wary, distrustful of an unknown power that seemed to emerge from nothing. But Shaka, with his understanding of both war and diplomacy, knew how to play the game. He sent envoys to those who were close, spoke of friendship, and offered a chance for unity. At the same time, his armies marched. The sound of the Zulu drums rattled the bones of the earth, a call to arms that no one could ignore. In every raid and every battle, they came, unstoppable, fierce, and precise. And in the wake of each victory, Shaka's reach grew further. Kingdoms that once stood alone now found themselves on the verge of collapse. And to save themselves, they had to make a choice: either submit to Shaka's growing empire or face the destruction of their own people. But it wasn't always about overwhelming force. Shaka understood that sometimes the might of his army was not enough. He used his military genius not only in the heat of battle, but in the quieter moments when he was seated with the leaders of other clans. He offered alliances, marriage treaties, and promises of wealth. In return, they had to swear loyalty to him. In this way, his influence stretched outward, each new alliance an invisible thread binding another kingdom to his growing empire. Yet, there was something haunting in the way Shaka moved among his enemies. While his warriors tore through villages and cities, leaving nothing but the ghostly remnants of the life that once was, Shaka himself remained focused. His ambition burned like a fire that could not be quenched. Each conquest, each village claimed, brought him closer to the kingdom he dreamed of, the empire he could not yet see fully but knew would one day be his. And as Shaka's name spread from one tribe to another, it was no longer just a name. They began to see him as the force that could no longer be ignored. Some came to him willingly, seeing the strength of his empire as a way to secure their own future. Others, too proud or too stubborn to bend, paid a heavy price. The wars that followed were brutal, unyielding. When Shaka's MP set foot on foreign soil, it was as though the land itself trembled. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and with every new campaign, Shaka's empire expanded. But it was never just the warriors who had forged his success. It was his ability to read the hearts of men, to know when to strike and when to offer a hand of peace. The Zulu king was not just a warlord, he was a ruler of unparalleled skill, able to maneuver both on the battlefield and within the delicate web of alliances. One by one, kingdoms fell, their leaders either bowing to his might or being crushed beneath the weight of their defiance. Yet, there was always an undercurrent of strategy. The battlefield was never the only place where Shaka sought victory. He met with rival chiefs, their hands shaking in uncertainty as he spoke with calm resolve, offering them a chance to join his vision or watch as their lands crumbled into ruin. Shaka's tactics, though ruthless, were also born of a deep understanding of power. He knew that victory wasn't always about breaking the spirit of his enemy, it was about bending it to his will. And through these wars and alliances, the foundation of the Zulu nation began to solidify. But even as his empire grew, Shaka did not lose sight of what had brought him to this point, his people. He had fought for them, bled for them, and now, in the heat of conquest, he still carried their hopes and dreams on his shoulders. Every battle, every conquest, was not just for the glory of war, it was for the future of the Zulu people. The empire he was building would not just be a monument to his own greatness, but to the unity and strength of his people. The kingdom grew, and so did the number of those who swore fealty to him. The world now knew that Shaka was not just a king, he was a force of nature, one whose ambition was as fierce as the winds that swept across the plains. His name would be whispered on the lips of his enemies and echoed in the halls of the mighty. As he stood at the helm of his growing empire, he knew that the dream he had fought for was becoming a reality. But in the shadows of his success, there were those who watched with unease. They knew that with every kingdom Shaka absorbed, with every tribe that bowed to him, his power only deepened. And though alliances were formed and enemies fell, Shaka's vision remained unchanged. He would unify all, and his empire would stand forever. With every new conquest, Shaka moved closer to making that dream a terrifying truth. The air hung heavy with the smell of earth and iron, and the cries of battle faded into an eerie silence. As the warriors lowered their spears, they looked upon their leader, a man who seemed untouched by the chaos around him. Shaka stood in the center of the battlefield, his figure towering like a legend come to life, his eyes scanning the horizon as though seeking his next conquest. To those who followed him, and even to those who dared to oppose him, he was more than a king. He was invincible. Stories of Shaka's unyielding power spread like wildfire, weaving themselves into the hearts and minds of his people. They spoke of battles where his presence alone turned the tide, where his enemies faltered at the sight of him, and where his warriors fought as though protected by unseen forces. It was said that no spear could pierce him, no arrow could touch him. He moved through the chaos of war with a grace that seemed otherworldly, his shadow casting fear into the hearts of all who dared stand against him. There was one tale that was whispered in awe around countless fires. It was the story of a battle fought under the pale light of the moon. Shaka had led his warriors into an ambush, a trap set by an enemy desperate to end his reign. The odds were impossible, his men outnumbered, the enemy's position fortified. Yet, as the battle began, something extraordinary happened. Shaka, at the forefront, charged without hesitation. Arrows rained down, but not one found its mark. Spears lunged toward him, but he moved as though guided by the spirits themselves, his steps precise and unerring. Witnesses claimed that his enemies seemed paralyzed by an unseen force. Their movements slowed, their strikes faltered, and as Shaka advanced, it was as if he carried the power of an entire storm within him. By dawn, the ambush had failed, the enemy defeated, and Shaka stood among his warriors, untouched. From that day forward, they said the gods walked with him, protecting him in battle, marking him as their chosen one. There was another story of a river crossing. Shaka and his warriors had pursued an enemy tribe across treacherous waters swollen by recent rains. The currents were strong enough to sweep away the strongest man, but Shaka, holding the iconic Ikilwa in hand, stepped into the water without hesitation. The river, as if recognizing his power, seemed to part for him. He crossed unscathed, his warriors following close behind, their fear replaced by an unshakable faith in their leader. The enemy, upon seeing this display, surrendered without a fight, believing that no mortal man could defy nature itself. These stories grew with each passing day, shaping Shaka's image into something larger than life. Mothers told their children about the time when Shaka faced a lion in the wild. He had no weapon, no shield, only his bare hands. The beast roared, its claws tearing at the earth, but Shaka stood firm. They said he stared into the lion's eyes, unblinking, until the creature bowed its head and walked away. Whether it was truth or myth didn't matter. To his people, it was a sign of his divine protection. Even his enemies spoke of him with a mixture of fear and reverence. They believed that he could not be killed, that his blood was sacred and his spirit eternal. Some claimed that Shaka's strength came from his connection to the ancestors, that their spirits guided his every move. Others whispered that he had been blessed by the Sangomas, his body made impervious to harm by ancient rituals. Whatever the truth, it was undeniable that Shaka carried an aura that made him seem untouchable and vulnerable. His warriors drew strength from these tales, their belief in his invincibility driving them to fight harder, faster, fiercer than ever before. They were no longer just soldiers, they were men fighting alongside a living legend. Each battle became a testament to his power, each victory another chapter in the story of his invulnerability. But there was one moment that stood above all others, a moment that cemented Shaka's place as a figure of legend. During a fierce battle against a rival clan, Shaka was said to have faced down an entire regiment alone. They surrounded him, their spears poised to strike, but Shaka did not flinch. He raised his Ikilwa, and the sky seemed to darken. Thunder rumbled, though no storm clouds were in sight, and the earth trembled beneath his feet. When the dust cleared, the regiment lay defeated, their weapons broken, their spirits shattered. Shaka walked away unscathed, his warriors cheering his name as though he were a god. These stories, these legends, were more than just tales of bravery. They were the foundation of a belief that turned ordinary men into extraordinary warriors. Shaka's invincibility became a symbol, a source of hope and strength for his people. It was said that as long as Shaka lived, the Zulu nation could never fall. And so, they followed him, not just out of loyalty, but out of faith, a faith that no weapon could harm him, no enemy could defeat him, and no force on earth could stand against him. Even in the quiet moments, when the battles were over and the land lay silent, the aura of invincibility surrounded Shaka. His presence was a constant reminder that he was not just a king, but a force of nature, a man who seemed to defy the very laws of existence. And as the stories of his miraculous victories continued to grow, so too did his legend, until the line between man and myth began to blur. Shaka's name became synonymous with power, resilience, and an unbreakable spirit. His people believed that he was destined to lead them to greatness, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would guide them through. And as they looked to their king, standing tall and untouchable, they knew that with Shaka, they were unstoppable. The future of the Zulu nation was secure, its foundation built on the strength of a man who had become a living legend. The first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the landscape with hues of gold and amber. In the heart of the Zulu lands, herds of cattle moved like rivers of life across the plains. Their presence was more than just a sign of prosperity, they were the lifeblood of the people, a sacred bond between land, spirit, and survival. And at the center of this connection stood Shaka, a man who could turn scarcity into abundance, hardship into triumph. It was whispered that Shaka had an unparalleled gift, a touch that seemed to coax miracles from the earth itself. They called it the power of the cattle, a mystical ability to multiply herds beyond reason. Farmers and warriors alike told stories of barren fields that suddenly teemed with grazing animals after Shaka's intervention. To the Zulu, cattle were more than wealth, they were a measure of power, an emblem of spiritual harmony, and the foundation of social bonds. And Shaka seemed to command them as though he held the keys to the universe. The tales began with a drought that had parched the lands for months. Streams dried up, the soil cracked underfoot, and the cattle herds began to thin, their ribs protruding like the branches of dying trees. Fear gripped the hearts of the people, but Shaka remained calm. One evening, he called for a gathering. Standing tall under the silver glow of the moon, he raised his hands and spoke with a voice that carried both authority and warmth. "Fear not," he said. "The ancestors walk with us, and they will not let us perish." The next morning, the air carried a strange stillness. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. First, it was a faint rumble, but it grew louder until the earth seemed to shake. A herd of cattle, large and magnificent, appeared on the horizon, their hides gleaming under the sun. They moved with a calm precision, as if guided by an unseen hand, until they reached the center of the village. The people stood in awe, their disbelief melting into jubilation. Shaka had delivered them from despair, and from that day on, they believed he could summon cattle at will. Whether it was the work of strategy or something more divine, none dared to question it. To them, it was proof that Shaka's connection to the spiritual realm was unbreakable, that he was chosen to protect and provide for his people. Another story spoke of a rival clan that had stolen a significant portion of the Zulu herds. Furious but determined, Shaka refused to retaliate with immediate violence. Instead, he sent an emissary with a simple message: "Return what you have taken, and your people will know peace." The rival clan scoffed, mocking his restraint. Yet, within days, their own cattle began to vanish. Every morning, they would wake to find fewer animals in their pens, their footprints leading back toward Zulu lands. When they finally sent word of surrender, they discovered that not only had Shaka reclaimed the stolen herds, but the numbers had inexplicably doubled. To the Zulu, this was not just a demonstration of Shaka's ingenuity or tactical brilliance, it was a sign of his divine favor. They believed the spirits blessed him with the power to protect their wealth and ensure the prosperity of the nation. Cattle were also deeply entwined with spiritual rituals and social harmony. When conflicts arose between clans, the gifting of cattle served as both apology and reparation. When marriages were arranged, the exchange of cattle symbolized a bond not just between individuals, but between families and their ancestors. In every aspect of Zulu life, cattle were a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. And Shaka, with his enigmatic ability to increase their numbers, seemed to embody that bridge. There were even whispers of a sacred herd, hidden deep in the valleys, accessible only to Shaka. These cattle were said to be larger, stronger, and more vibrant than any others, their coats shimmering as if woven from sunlight. It was said that they carried the blessings of the ancestors and could never be harmed by predators or stolen by enemies. On rare occasions, when the Zulu faced dire need, Shaka would bring forth a small number of these sacred cattle, ensuring the survival of his people. Whether this herd truly existed or was a creation of collective hope, it strengthened the belief that Shaka's rule was ordained by forces beyond human comprehension. Not all the tales were triumphant, though. One story spoke of a famine so severe that even Shaka's legendary abilities were tested. The cattle began to dwindle despite his efforts, their lowing a mournful echo across the barren lands. Desperate, Shaka led a ceremony, calling upon the Sangomas and elders to guide him. Together, they performed rituals, their chants rising like smoke to the heavens. The skies darkened, and for days the village waited in silence. Then, on the seventh day, the rains returned, gentle at first, but soon growing into a deluge. The fields turned green once more, and the cattle herds began to thrive. It was a reminder that even Shaka, for all his power, was still bound by the will of the ancestors, a balance between human effort and divine intervention. Through these stories, Shaka's connection to cattle became inseparable from his identity as a leader. He was not just a warrior or a strategist, he was a provider, a protector, and a symbol of prosperity. His ability to multiply herds and safeguard their survival became a metaphor for his role in uniting and sustaining the Zulu people. The myths surrounding Shaka's cattle were more than folklore, they were a testament to the values that defined the Zulu nation. They spoke of resilience in the face of adversity, the importance of community and generosity, and the unbreakable bond between the living and the spirit world. Through these tales, Shaka became not just a leader, but a legend, a man who could command the forces of nature and ensure that his people would never go hungry. The cattle were not just animals, they were the embodiment of the Zulu soul, and Shaka was their keeper. The sound of war drums echoed in the distance, a rhythmic beat that sent tremors through the heart of the Zulu kingdom. Shaka, standing tall, his mind focused, could hear the pulse of his people's fears. Victory after victory had forged his empire, but in the shadows, resentment had begun to grow. As he surveyed the land before him, a burning realization gripped him: his enemies were no longer distant. They were now at his doorstep. Once, his name had been whispered in awe, his reputation as an unstoppable force echoing through the lands. But now, those same whispers were turning to sharp, venomous words. His rise to power, which had been built on strength, discipline, and the bonds of unity, had also sown seeds of hatred. The very people who had once stood by him, who had pledged loyalty, began to question his rule. And in the silence of the night, beneath the burning stars, betrayal took root. It was not just the clans that opposed him, the very essence of his empire was under threat. Former allies, who had once fought beside him, now turned their backs, seeking alliances with his enemies. They had grown jealous, fearful of Shaka's growing power, and saw in his ambition a threat to their own survival. The warmth of brotherhood had turned cold, and in its place, there was only the bitter taste of treason. Among these enemies was a man whose name was whispered with contempt: Dingaan, Shaka's own brother. Blood had once bound them together, but now that same blood felt like a curse. The bond between them, forged in childhood and shared struggles, had shattered. Dingaan, once a trusted ally, now stood on the side of those who sought to bring Shaka down. His betrayal cut deep, like a knife to the heart of the Zulu nation. What had caused this rift? Was it ambition, resentment, or the weight of too many years in Shaka's shadow? Whatever the cause, it became clear that Shaka could no longer trust those closest to him. The betrayal of Dingaan was only one of many. Rival tribes, seeing the cracks in Shaka's empire, began to rise. The Mthethwa, once a powerful ally, turned against him, threatening the stability of the kingdom he had fought so hard to build. The Nwandwa, too, began to gather strength, challenging Shaka's hold on the land. They saw an opportunity in his perceived weakness, and their warriors, once afraid to face the might of Shaka's impi, now believed they could win. But it wasn't just the rival tribes that posed a threat. There was a growing restlessness within the very walls of the kingdom. The strict discipline Shaka had instilled in his army, the demands of loyalty and sacrifice, began to take their toll. His relentless pursuit of power, while unmatched in its ambition, had worn down the spirits of his people. Some spoke in hushed tones of a tyrant, others of a king who had forgotten his roots. The fires of rebellion flickered in the hearts of those who had once stood by him. Shaka had always known that his enemies would rise against him, but the weight of betrayal stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. The faces of those who had pledged loyalty to him now haunted his every thought. His brother's defection, the whispers of discontent from his own people, the uprising of rival clans, all these forces combined to form a storm that threatened to engulf everything he had built. But Shaka was not a man to back down. His heart burned with a fire that refused to be extinguished. He could feel the pull of destiny, the weight of his purpose. Even as the shadows of treachery grew longer, he refused to let fear take root. His empire was not built on weakness, and he would not let it fall to the whims of those who sought to destroy him. The rise of enemies only fueled Shaka's resolve. In his mind, the path forward was clear: to defeat the enemies of his kingdom, to face those who betrayed him, and to show the world that no one could break the will of the Zulu people. The battles that lay ahead would not be easy, but Shaka knew they were necessary. His enemies would learn, as they had so many times before, that there was no force greater than the fury of the Zulu nation under his command. With every challenge, Shaka's legend grew. The defeat of each rival tribe, the suppression of rebellion within his ranks, became part of the myth that surrounded his name. His strength was unmatched, but so too was his ability to inspire loyalty in those who remained by his side. In the face of treachery, he had become a symbol of unity. The bloodshed of battle, the sacrifices made by those who still believed in him, only solidified his place in history. Yet, as the forces against him gathered strength, one question loomed over Shaka's mind: how much longer could he hold the empire together? His enemies were many, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The betrayal stung, but they only made him more determined to prove that nothing, not even the betrayal of his closest kin, could destroy the kingdom he had built with his own hands. The rise of Shaka's enemies marked a new chapter in his reign, one that would test the very limits of his power. But for Shaka, it was simply another challenge to face, another trial to overcome. And in the heart of every battle, his spirit burned with an unyielding force, reminding the world that the Zulu Empire was not to be underestimated. The storm may have been gathering, but Shaka was ready to face it head-on, no matter what the cost. The night was thick with the scent of burning wood, the crackling fire casting long shadows across the faces of the men and women who gathered in the heart of Shaka's court. The air was heavy with tension, yet there was also a palpable sense of purpose. This was where the destiny of the Zulu nation would be shaped, and Shaka's presence loomed over it all, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. But behind the unshakable will of the king, there were others, those who whispered advice, shaped his strategies, and helped him navigate the dangerous currents of power. In the flickering light, the faces of Shaka's most trusted advisors were etched with intensity. Each one played a part in his empire's rise, but they were not without their own ambitions and desires. The warriors, proud and loyal, stood with their chests swelling with pride, their hands steady on the weapons that had made Shaka's empire feared. Yet, in the quiet moments, they too knew the stakes. They understood the weight of the king's decisions, for they were the ones who would follow him into the fires of war. Their loyalty was unbreakable, but there was always the unspoken question of what would happen when the flames grew too high. Among these warriors was Dambuza, Shaka's trusted general. His sword had cleaved through the hearts of enemies, and his strategy had often outsmarted rival chiefs. But beneath his imposing exterior, there was a calculating mind, one that weighed every decision with precision. He was not just a warrior, he was a planner, a thinker. But even the most brilliant mind had its moments of doubt. Could Shaka's ambition be the undoing of the Zulu nation? Could the king's hunger for power tear apart the very empire they had built together? Then there was Nandi, Shaka's mother. Her presence in the court was not one of formal power, but her influence was undeniable. As a spiritual guide, she understood the hearts of men and the gods. She was a woman whose love for her son ran deep, but she also knew the price of his ambition. She had seen him rise from the ashes of exile to become the ruler of a great nation, and yet, she also understood the toll it took. The whispers of treachery, the growing unrest in the kingdom, these weighed heavily on her heart. Would Shaka, her son, be the one to bring peace, or would he be consumed by the very power he sought to control? The inner circle was not just made up of warriors and advisors, it was also shaped by those who played a quieter, but no less important role, the spiritual guides. These men and women could read the omens, speak to the ancestors, and interpret the will of the gods. Shaka, a man of strength and power, had learned to respect the unseen forces that governed his fate. His spiritual guides, like his mother, were both his protectors and his conscience. In the silence of the night, they would whisper warnings of things to come, urging him to walk the fine line between ambition and destruction. The power dynamics within Shaka's court were delicate. Beneath the surface of loyalty and respect, there were currents of tension. Everyone, from the warriors to the spiritual guides, had their own ideas about what was best for the kingdom. Some of Shaka's advisors pushed him toward more aggressive tactics, believing that the only way to secure the Zulu Empire was through domination and fear. Others, like Nandi, urged caution, reminding him that power without compassion would leave the land in ruins. But Shaka, in his relentless pursuit of greatness, often shut out those voices that called for restraint. It was a court built on ambition, but also one filled with whispers of doubt. How far could Shaka go before his insatiable hunger for power consumed everything? Would his trusted allies remain loyal when the darkness of war grew too thick? Could he balance the advice of his mother with the urgings of his warriors? As the fire flickered and the shadows grew long, one could see the faces of the men and women in Shaka's court illuminated by the light of the flames. Their eyes were filled with determination, but also fear, fear of the future, fear of what they had helped build, and fear of the king who had made them all part of his grand vision. Shaka was their leader, their king, but the path they walked was uncertain. The stakes were higher now than ever before, and even those closest to him couldn't shake the feeling that something, somewhere, was about to break. The discussions around the fire became more intense as the night wore on. The future of the Zulu nation hung in the balance. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, and the empire Shaka had worked so hard to build could come crashing down. But in the heart of that circle, Shaka remained calm, his gaze unwavering. He had built an empire, and he would do anything to protect it, even if it meant sacrificing those who had once been his closest allies. In the quiet of the night, as the fire died down to embers, the weight of the decisions before him seemed almost unbearable. The warriors, the spiritual guides, his own mother, they all played a part in shaping Shaka's destiny. But in the end, it was his choices that would define the future of the Zulu people. And so, in the heart of his court, under the watchful eyes of his inner circle, Shaka prepared for the next move. The power dynamics within his empire were shifting, and even those closest to him could feel the tension rising. Would Shaka's court remain united, or would the cracks that had begun to form lead to a fracture that could never be mended? As the firelight flickered and the whispers of the night grew softer, one thing was clear: Shaka's empire, like his court, was built on a delicate balance of power, loyalty, and fear. And in the silence of the night, it was impossible to tell which would break first, the king or his kingdom. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a sickly orange hue across the land. The earth, once rich and fertile, now seemed to crack under the weight of an unforgiving drought. The people of the Zulu kingdom watched in silence as their crops withered and the rivers, once swollen with life, now lay barren. It wasn't just the land that seemed to be dying, it felt as if something deeper, something primal, was unraveling. The famine had come, and with it, a darkness that crept into the hearts of even the bravest warriors. Shaka stood on the edge of his kingdom, eyes fixed on the horizon where the dry winds swept across the plains. He could see it, the toll the famine was taking on his people. The once vibrant villages, now shadows of what they had been, stood eerily still. The cries of hungry children echoed in the distance, their voices desperate, pleading for the relief that was nowhere to be found. This was not just a test of survival, it was a test of Shaka's leadership, of the very heart of the empire he had built. How could a king, revered for his strength and ambition, face something that no army, no weapon, could defeat? The earth itself had turned against them, and no matter how strong his warriors were, there was no victory to be won over nature's wrath. The very people who had once sung his praises now turned their faces away, their eyes clouded with hunger and despair. The once feared leader, the ruler who had shaped the future of the Zulu nation with his iron will, now stood on the brink of losing everything. There were whispers in the villages. Whispers that the gods were angry. Some said that the famine was a sign, a divine punishment for the bloodshed that Shaka had wrought in his rise to power. Others believed that it was a curse, one that had been set upon the land when the great king had killed too many and upset the balance of the natural world. These beliefs spread like wildfire, seeping into the hearts of those who had once trusted Shaka without question. Could the famine be his fault? Had his ambition angered the gods to such an extent that they had taken the land from him? The elders, their faces etched with the weight of years, gathered in secret to consult the spirits. Their chants filled the air, invoking the ancestors, pleading for guidance in the face of disaster. The omens they received were troubling, visions of dark clouds rolling in, swallowing the light, and of rivers running dry, never to be replenished. They spoke of a king who would face his downfall if he did not appease the spirits, if he did not act with humility and understanding. The famine, they said, was a test of the very soul of the ruler. It would either break him or forge him into something greater. But Shaka, despite the growing unease in his court and the unrest spreading through the kingdom, would not bend. His pride, his unyielding belief in his own strength, made him blind to the suffering of those around him. He saw the famine not as a divine test, but as a challenge, a battle that he could win through sheer force of will. The people were hungry, yes, but they would endure. They had no choice. He would fight the hunger the only way he knew how, with power. The cries of the people reached a fever pitch as the famine stretched on, days bleeding into weeks, and weeks into months. The very earth seemed to reject them, and Shaka's strength, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like an empty gesture. He called upon his warriors, sending them on raids to neighboring tribes in search of food. But even their might could not bring an end to the suffering. They returned empty-handed, their faces drawn and weary, their weapons dulled by the endless struggle. In the villages, mothers clutched their children, their faces hollow with fear. Fathers, once strong and proud, now struggled to stand. They had no food to feed their families, and no hope for the future. Some turned to the stories of the past, remembering the ancient ways of their ancestors, hoping that the gods might hear their pleas and lift the curse that had befallen them. Others began to question everything they had believed in, wondering if the gods had abandoned them altogether. But through it all, Shaka remained defiant. He refused to acknowledge the growing despair that surrounded him. To do so would mean admitting that he was powerless, and that was something he could not bear. In the silence of his throne room, Shaka held court as usual, his eyes cold and unyielding. The famine raged on outside, but inside the walls of his palace, he refused to let it break him. Yet, as the days wore on, even Shaka's resolve began to crack. The weight of the kingdom's suffering pressed down on him, and in moments of solitude, he could feel the strain in his heart. Was the famine really a punishment, as the elders said? Was this truly the will of the gods, or was it simply the result of a world that could no longer bear the weight of so much ambition? In the darkest hours of the night, when the firelight flickered and shadows danced on the walls, Shaka would stand by his window and stare out at the desolate landscape. The wind howled like a mournful song, and the land seemed to call to him, pleading for him to do something, anything, to end the suffering. The once bountiful fields had turned to dust, and the rivers ran dry, their once cool waters now but a memory. The myths of Shaka's reign, of his divine protection and invincibility, seemed to crumble before his eyes. He had once been seen as a man above the reach of fate, but now, with the land dying beneath his feet, he was just another ruler, another man facing forces beyond his control. The famine had become a cruel equalizer, reminding him that even the greatest kings were subject to the whims of nature. As the famine stretched on, the Zulu people looked to their king for salvation, but Shaka found himself unsure of how to answer. His strength, his power, had been his greatest asset, but in the face of such a disaster, it felt meaningless. The myths that had once surrounded him, the tales of his invulnerability, his divine protection, seemed more like distant memories than truths. The famine was real, and it had no mercy. The whispers of the gods, of divine will, continued to echo through the kingdom. Was Shaka the man to restore balance, or was he just another figure in the long line of kings who had come and gone? The answers seemed elusive, just out of reach, like the very rain that never came. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the Zulu kingdom as ships appeared on the distant edge of the sea. These were not the familiar canoes that lined the shores, but foreign vessels with strange sails and hulls that seemed to cut through the water like phantoms. On board, men from faraway lands, with pale faces and strange accents, had arrived. Their intentions were unknown, but their presence was undeniable. The winds whispered of them, carrying stories from the far corners of the earth. Whispers of trade, of missionaries, and of the looming clash of worldviews. The first encounters were cautious, laced with curiosity. European traders and missionaries made their way into the heart of Shaka's domain, their eyes wide with wonder as they observed the fierce and vibrant Zulu people. They marveled at the strength of Shaka's warriors, their towering shields and spears, and the way the land seemed to pulse with an energy beyond their understanding. To them, it was a kingdom unlike any other, a place of myth and legend where power radiated from every corner. But for Shaka, these strangers were not mere curiosities. They were a challenge, a test of his empire's strength and his vision for the future. The Zulu kingdom had been built on the blood of his enemies, the loyalty of his people, and the might of his warriors. He had brought together fragmented clans, carved out an empire from the bones of his ancestors, and now these foreign powers, these people who did not understand his world, dared to step onto his soil. What did they want? What would they bring? The Europeans had their own dreams, their own goals. Traders sought to barter and create new avenues of wealth, while missionaries came with their eyes set on converting the heathens, as they called them. Their words, so foreign and incomprehensible, seemed to Shaka like whispers from a distant, hollow land. The promise of Christianity, the doctrine of a foreign god who had no place in the world of his ancestors, seemed an insult. To him, the ancestors and spirits that guided his people were not just stories, they were real, living forces that shaped their world. As the foreign presence grew, Shaka's feelings shifted from curiosity to suspicion. The missionaries spoke of peace, of love, of a new way of life. But peace had never been the foundation of his reign. Shaka's rise had been built on strength, on warfare, on the blood of those who stood against him. He had unified his people through fear, respect, and the unrelenting will to survive. And now these strangers, with their strange gods and foreign ways, seemed to challenge everything he had worked for. The first diplomatic meetings were tense. The Europeans offered goods, beads, cloth, and trinkets that gleamed with the promise of trade, but these things meant little to Shaka. To him, power was measured not in beads, but in the strength of his warriors, the loyalty of his people, and the integrity of his land. What did these foreign traders understand of power? What did they know of the intricacies of warfare and strategy that had shaped his rise? Nothing, it seemed. And yet, they came, with offers of alliances, with promises of trade that seemed too good to be true. Shaka listened, but the weight of their words carried little meaning. They spoke of things he could not grasp, ideas that had no place in his world. But it was not just their offers that he questioned. There was something more, something that gnawed at him, the way they looked at his people, the way they spoke of his kingdom. It was as if they saw his empire through a veil of pity, as if they believed it to be a primitive land, untouched by the sophistication of the world beyond the sea. The missionaries, with their holy books and prayers, seemed determined to erase the very fabric of Zulu identity. They spoke of a world that was meant to be ruled by one God, and they did so with such conviction, as if their beliefs held all the answers. But Shaka knew that no one could know all the answers. His kingdom was founded on the belief that the spirits of the ancestors were the true guiding forces. The earth, the skies, the winds, all of them spoke to him, and the ancestors guided his hand. These foreign ideas, these foreign gods, were nothing but stories that threatened to unravel the very essence of his people. And yet, despite his distrust, Shaka could not ignore the potential power these foreign traders and missionaries represented. They had something that no one in his kingdom had ever seen: guns, cannons, weapons of mass destruction that could change the course of history. And their ships, with their massive sails, seemed like floating fortresses, as though the sea itself bowed to them. To Shaka, these foreign powers were a threat, but they were also a potential advantage. Could they be useful to him? Could their technology and their wealth serve his ambitions? Could these foreigners be manipulated, just as he had manipulated the tribes of his own land? It was this delicate balance that Shaka tried to maintain, and understanding that in their hands lay the keys to greater power, but also the potential for destruction. The Europeans saw his people as exotic, a living curiosity, but Shaka understood them as potential tools that could either aid in his quest for dominance or become the very weapon that would destroy him. The battle for Zulu sovereignty was not just a matter of shields and spears anymore, it was a game of ideas, of worldviews that clashed with an intensity Shaka had never before experienced. Over time, the presence of the Europeans grew. Trade flourished, and yet the missionaries continued to push their beliefs, trying to convert the Zulu to their ways. Shaka's people, however, resisted. They fought for their beliefs, for the land that had shaped them. But the weight of foreign influence, whether in the form of guns, goods, or missionaries, hung heavy on the kingdom. There was a new kind of war being waged, one that could not be won by weapons alone. This was a battle for the very soul of the Zulu people. Through it all, Shaka remained steadfast. He had forged an empire through strength and unity, and he would protect it from the foreign influences that threatened to tear it apart. But the Europeans were relentless, their belief in their own superiority only growing with each encounter. The clash of these two worlds, the ancient ways of the Zulu people and the foreign power of Europe, was inevitable. Shaka could feel it, like a storm building on the horizon, a force that would change everything. As the ships grew larger and the missionaries spoke louder, Shaka knew that this was only the beginning. The struggle for his kingdom was no longer just about battles fought with spears and shields. It was about something much deeper, a struggle to preserve the very identity of the Zulu people. And as Shaka faced the foreign presence on his shores, he understood one thing with certainty: the world would never be the same again. The air was thick with the weight of destiny as Shaka stood at the pinnacle of his empire. His name echoed in the hearts of his people like a storm, a symbol of strength and invincibility. The warriors stood tall before him, their shields gleaming, their spears raised high in salute. There was no force in the world that could challenge the might of the Zulu kingdom. Shaka had built it from the dust, piece by piece, forging an empire with blood, sweat, and fire. His power was unmatched. But even at this peak, a storm was brewing within him, a storm that no one could see. As Shaka's empire flourished, so did the myths surrounding him. Stories of his genius in battle spread far and wide, tales of victories that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. He was invincible, a godlike figure whose strength and intellect knew no equal. The world looked at him with awe and fear. But beneath the armor of power, Shaka was not untouchable. He was human, flesh and blood, and like all men, he had his vulnerabilities. It was during these moments of quiet reflection that Shaka's greatest tragedy would strike. His mother, Nandi, the woman who had given him life, the woman who had shaped him, who had whispered the ancient wisdom of their people into his ear, was taken from him. Nandi's death was a blow that shattered the very core of Shaka's being. It wasn't just the loss of a mother, it was the loss of his foundation, the one person who had seen him through the darkest days of his life, the one person who had believed in him when the world had turned its back. The myths surrounding Shaka's grief are almost as powerful as the stories of his victories. They speak of a king who could not be defeated on the battlefield but was undone by the deep sorrow of a broken heart. After Nandi's death, it is said that Shaka entered a state of rage so intense that it seemed like the heavens themselves mourned with him. His tears, mixed with fury, flowed like rivers, his grief consuming him like a fire that could not be quenched. The Zulu people, who had followed Shaka through countless battles, saw their king, a man of power and invincibility, reduced to something fragile, something human. It is said that the land itself seemed to mourn with him. The skies darkened, the winds howled, and the earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet. There were whispers that the ancestors had abandoned him, that his grief was so powerful it had shaken the very foundation of the world. Some even believed that Nandi's spirit had come to reclaim him, pulling him into the depths of despair. Shaka's rage was not just the expression of a son mourning his mother, it was a fire that consumed his very soul. His warriors feared him in a way they had never feared before. The once indomitable king now seemed like a shadow of his former self, a man twisted by loss, grief, and rage. He punished those who could not live up to his expectations, his wrath cutting through his own people with the same merciless precision he had once reserved for his enemies. It was a terrifying spectacle, watching the mighty king, whose very name had once struck terror in the hearts of his enemies, unleash his fury on those closest to him. The myths surrounding this period tell of strange and chilling acts. One legend speaks of Shaka ordering the deaths of hundreds of cattle, the very symbol of wealth and power in his kingdom, because they could not bring him comfort in his grief. The earth, it is said, became barren as the life force of the cattle was extinguished in a single, savage moment. The king's sorrow became a storm that tore through the very land he had built. No one was spared from the devastation of his loss. It was as though his heart had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, each one cutting deeper than the last. But even in the midst of this destruction, Shaka's strength was undeniable. He did not allow his sorrow to break him completely. He could still see the path ahead, though it was clouded by grief. His will to lead, to rule, and to protect his people never wavered, though it was tested in ways no one could have imagined. The death of Nandi was a turning point, a moment when the world seemed to collapse around Shaka, and yet, it was also the moment when he became more than just a king. The transformation that followed was as dramatic as the grief that had consumed him. Shaka emerged from his personal hell like a phoenix rising from the ashes. He reassembled his empire, reasserting his dominance, and rebuilt the strength of his army. But something had changed in him. The grief, the rage, it had carved a new path in his soul, a path that would lead him to ever greater heights, but also to darker depths. He had witnessed the fragility of life, and it made him fiercer, more relentless. The myth of Shaka's invincibility had only grown stronger after Nandi's death, for in his grief, he had become a creature of power beyond understanding. And yet, there was something tragically beautiful about Shaka's response to his loss. The rage that had consumed him could not be quenched by violence alone. It was his grief that shaped him into a legend, that turned him into a figure of myth. People spoke of him as a man of fire, a warrior who could never be tamed, a king whose heart burned with the fury of the gods. But they also spoke of him as a man broken by love and loss, a king whose greatest triumphs were forever shadowed by the tragedy that had defined him. The pain of losing Nandi never truly left him. It haunted him like a ghost, always lurking in the background of his every victory. And yet, the world knew only of Shaka the Conqueror, the king who had unified tribes, the ruler who had built an empire that stretched across the land. But behind every triumph, there was a tragedy. Behind every victory, there was the heartache of a son who had lost the most important person in his life. As Shaka's empire reached its peak, the personal cost of his rise to power became undeniable. His mythic strength, his invincibility on the battlefield, these things were built on a foundation of deep pain. In the quiet moments, when the drums of war ceased and the world fell silent, Shaka's heart ached. And in that silence, the truth became clear: even the greatest of kings could be broken by the weight of grief. The air in the kingdom had shifted. It wasn't just the wind that felt different. It was the atmosphere, charged, heavy, like a storm was always just on the horizon. Shaka, once a symbol of unstoppable power, stood at the top of his world. The empire he had built stretched across vast lands, a force to be reckoned with. Yet, something inside him had changed. The very power that had once driven him forward now seemed to twist him, slowly turning his strength into something darker, more dangerous. There were whispers in the corners of the kingdom, soft, fearful murmurs that spoke of the curse of power. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the idle gossip of frightened souls. But as time wore on, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. It was the way Shaka's eyes had begun to change, how his face seemed to grow colder, harder. The world had once looked at him with awe, now they looked at him with fear. And what was worse, he felt it too. The paranoia gnawed at him like a constant ache, growing stronger with every passing day. Who could he trust? Who might betray him? Even his closest advisors, the people who had fought alongside him through every battle, were no longer safe in his presence. A king who had once been unstoppable, filled with a fire that burned with the will to conquer, was now consumed by a fire of a different kind, a fire that could not be extinguished. It was not the fire of ambition anymore, it was the fire of suspicion, a relentless blaze that scorched everything in its path, leaving only ashes. The people of his empire, once loyal, now feared their king. He had become a ruler of cruelty, a man whose every decision seemed guided by distrust and fury. No longer did Shaka inspire love or admiration. Now, he inspired terror. The stories of Shaka's growing paranoia were not just rumors. There were tales of how his nights had become sleepless, filled with visions of enemies both real and imagined. He began to see plots against him in every shadow, and every glance that wasn't quite right. His closest allies were forced to watch their every word, their every move, lest they fall prey to the king's ever-growing suspicion. The once legendary charisma that had bound the kingdom together now turned into a dangerous force. No longer was it a weapon that rallied his people, now it became a weapon that tore through them. Some say that the gods themselves began to turn their backs on him, offering up strange and ominous signs. It wasn't just the human betrayals that tormented him. There were the birds that circled overhead, darker and more numerous than ever before. The thunderstorms that raged for days, as if the heavens themselves were in turmoil. There were even stories of sacred animals, once believed to be protectors of the land, behaving erratically in his presence. These omens haunted him, feeding his belief that the very earth beneath his feet was beginning to shift, that his power would not last forever. He knew that every empire eventually crumbles, but in the back of his mind, he feared that his would fall before he was ready. He feared that the very thing he had built, this empire, this dream, was already beginning to decay. The cruelty that had overtaken him was almost too much to bear. He punished anyone who crossed him, even in the smallest of ways. His once loyal warriors, who had followed him without question, now found themselves under constant scrutiny. Even the smallest mistake, an offhand comment, a look that lingered too long, could send Shaka into a fit of rage. He demanded loyalty, not just in action, but in thought. He wanted his people to fear him, to worship him, to know that any rebellion, no matter how small, would be met with swift and brutal retribution. The stories that came out of his court were filled with darkness. The acts of violence grew more gruesome, more savage. No one was spared. Men, women, even children, if they were suspected of treachery, they paid the ultimate price. The very land that had once flourished under his rule began to wilt under the weight of his growing madness. It was as if the curse of power, the relentless pursuit of dominance, had finally consumed him, breaking the man he had once been. Some of the most chilling tales were those of his family, how the king's paranoia extended to even his blood. Brothers, cousins, sons, no one was beyond suspicion. His own flesh and blood feared to approach him, knowing that any word or action could be misinterpreted as an attempt to undermine his power. His court became a place of silence, where no one dared speak the truth. The once vibrant halls were now filled with whispers of survival, not of loyalty. Even the strongest of his warriors, the very men who had stood by him in battle, began to pull away. The fear of what Shaka might do to them, the growing uncertainty of their future, made them question their allegiance. The unshakable force of his rule was now teetering on the edge of collapse, not from an outside threat, but from the very core of his own soul. And then there were the dreams. Some said that Shaka was haunted by visions of his downfall, dreams that would leave him drenched in sweat, trembling in terror. In these dreams, he saw the same things, the betrayal of his closest friends, the collapse of his empire, and a darkness that seemed to consume everything he had worked for. The gods had warned him, or so the stories said. The omens had spoken, but Shaka had ignored them, convinced that his power was invincible, that nothing could bring him low. But the truth was beginning to seep through the cracks. It was too late for him to turn back. The kingdom that had once flourished under Shaka's rule now seemed to mirror his inner turmoil. The land that had once been filled with the sound of victory and celebration now echoed with the silence of fear and uncertainty. The very people who had once sung his praises now looked at him with dread, as though they too could feel the storm approaching, the inevitable end that could not be avoided. As Shaka's reign grew darker, so too did the legends surrounding him. His name was no longer a symbol of hope and power, but a warning, a tale of what happens when a man reaches too high, when the thirst for power blinds him to the very forces that had once made him great. The curse of power had taken hold of Shaka, and there was no escaping it. The stories of his reign would never forget the rise of a king, nor would they forget the fall that came after. The land was quiet, too quiet for those who had known the great Shaka as a king who commanded thunder in his every move. His empire, his proud, unshakable empire, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, as if the very earth itself mourned. And at the heart of it all stood Shaka, a towering figure who had never before shown weakness, but now was bowed by grief so deep it seemed to have swallowed him whole. The news came like a devastating storm. Nandi, his mother, the woman who had carried him through the earliest years of his life, was gone. The world that had once been so full of life for him now felt hollow, and in her absence, he was lost. Shaka, who had conquered lands, crushed enemies, and built an empire of untold power, suddenly seemed like a shadow of the man he had once been. His mother was everything to him, his strength, his foundation. And now she was gone. The shock of her death struck him like the fiercest of battles, and it broke something deep inside him. His heart, hardened by years of warfare and ambition, could not withstand the weight of this loss. His grief was not a quiet sorrow, it was a roar, a storm that shook the very core of his being. In the days that followed, Shaka's mourning rituals became a spectacle in themselves, extreme, terrifying in their intensity. The king who had once commanded legions of warriors now moved through his kingdom as if he were a ghost, consumed by a grief that knew no end. His actions became increasingly erratic, his mind clouded by sorrow. The people who once feared and admired him now watched in horror as he sank into a state of despair. Shaka ordered a mourning period like none had ever seen. The Zulu people, too, were commanded to mourn as he did. The land, once alive with the energy of military conquest and celebration, became a place of silent suffering. People wept, not only for Nandi, but for the man who had given them everything, who had fought to give them a future, and yet was now breaking under the weight of his own sorrow. Shaka's mourning was unlike any other. He commanded that no one was allowed to laugh, to smile, to show any signs of joy. His warriors, those who had once moved with precision and purpose, now walked in sorrow, their faces drawn and pale. The sound of drums, which had once celebrated his triumphs, were now muffled in the air. Even the women of the kingdom were ordered to shave their heads, a sign of their own mourning. The land, once vibrant with life, seemed to echo with the grief of a man whose heart had shattered in two. The rituals were unyielding, unrelenting. Shaka ordered that his people live without the comforts they had once known. No crops were to be harvested, no animals were to be slaughtered. The kingdom fell into a deep and unbroken silence. The streams of wealth that had once flowed into his empire now slowed to a trickle, as if the earth itself was mourning along with him. For months, the people of the kingdom had nothing but grief and emptiness to sustain them. It was a reflection of their king's own brokenness. As the mourning dragged on, the myths and stories surrounding the event began to spread, growing in intensity with every telling. The Zulu people spoke of strange happenings that seemed to coincide with Shaka's grief. They spoke of thunderstorms that raged for days on end, thunder that seemed to echo the king's pain. They spoke of the sun, which seemed to hide behind dark clouds, as though it too had retreated in sorrow. Some believed that the gods themselves had wept with Shaka. They told stories of spirits that appeared in the dark of night, wandering the kingdom, their mournful cries reaching the ears of the people. Others whispered that the very earth beneath their feet had begun to tremble in sympathy, as if it too felt the weight of the king's heartbreak. These stories were whispered around fires, shared in hushed tones among families. It was as though the whole world had paused to share in Shaka's grief. But for Shaka, the mourning was never enough. No ritual, no act of sorrow could fill the hole in his heart left by Nandi's death. She had been his strength, his guide, the one person he had trusted above all others. Now that she was gone, there was no one left to guide him. No one to stop him from spiraling deeper into the abyss. The stories that were told, the myths that grew around his mourning, only deepened his isolation. The king who had once commanded the world was now alone, surrounded only by the ghosts of his past and the silent stares of his people. The kingdom, his empire, began to suffer. The people, bound by his commands, had no food, no means to sustain themselves. Crops withered, and animals died. It was as though the kingdom itself had withered in response to the death of Nandi, as though the very lifeblood of the Zulu nation was draining away. The king's mourning, and the myths that grew around it, became part of the fabric of the Zulu people's collective memory. Shaka's grief became a story of its own, one that was passed down through generations. It was said that his mother's death broke not just his heart, but the heart of the kingdom. His sorrow was so great that it seemed to spread through the land like a sickness. And yet, even as the kingdom bled, even as the people cried out in despair, Shaka's mourning continued. It was a mourning that would never end, not for him, and not for the people who had watched their once great king fall into madness. Even in death, Nandi's presence was felt. The myths around her death and Shaka's mourning became so powerful, so intertwined with the story of his reign, that it became difficult to separate the two. Her memory became the turning point of his life, the moment when the king, once unstoppable, was finally broken. And the Zulu people, whose lives had been shaped by Shaka's rule, were left with a legend, one that would echo through the centuries, telling of a man who had built an empire, only to see it crumble under the weight of his own grief. The whispers started low, barely a murmur, but soon they grew louder, and the air around the mighty Zulu empire began to shift. Something was changing, something unspoken, but felt by everyone. The once unshakable power of Shaka, the king who had conquered lands, crushed enemies, and built an empire from the ashes, was beginning to falter. His empire, which had once been a force of nature, seemed to tremble under the weight of something far more subtle and dangerous. It began with his generals. Men who had fought beside him, bled for him, and made his vision their own, began to look at him differently. Where once they saw a leader whose vision was unyielding, they now saw a king whose grip on reality seemed to be loosening. They had stood at his side in battle, shared in his triumphs, and conquered together. But now, in the shadow of Shaka's grief and paranoia, they were no longer sure who they were following. The king had changed, and so had the kingdom. His once clear commands now felt erratic, driven more by emotions than by reason. The fear that had once fueled the loyalty of his warriors was no longer enough. The murmurs among the generals grew into quiet conversations, first behind closed doors, then in secret gatherings away from Shaka's watchful eyes. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they began to take root. They spoke of their king's changing nature, his growing cruelty, his unpredictable anger, and his obsession with power. The man who had once been a visionary leader now seemed consumed by paranoia, demanding more than ever from his people. It wasn't just the weight of his grief anymore, it was his insatiable thirst for control. He seemed willing to sacrifice anything, and anyone, for the preservation of his throne. What had once been a kingdom built on respect, unity, and shared vision now teetered on the edge of something darker. And it wasn't just the generals. The dissent was spreading like wildfire, reaching into the heart of Shaka's inner circle. His trusted advisors, the men who had once shaped his every move, began to ask themselves questions. Was this still the same king who had led them to victory? Was this the man they had followed without hesitation, the man they had sacrificed everything for? Or had something broken within him that could no longer be mended? The tension was palpable. It was in the way Shaka moved through his court, the way he looked at those who had once been his closest allies. The cracks were visible, but no one dared to speak them aloud. Those who had once feared his wrath began to question whether that wrath was still directed at their enemies, or now turned inward, toward those who had once been his most trusted companions. The air in the kingdom grew thick with unease, and no one was untouched by it. The warriors who had once marched with pride under Shaka's banner began to whisper among themselves. They had seen the king at his height, a leader who could not be defeated, a man whose presence alone could command victory. But now, they saw a man who seemed to be losing his grip, consumed by grief, paranoia, and unchecked power. His decisions became unpredictable, his temper volatile. His once steady hand now seemed to tremble. What had once been a tight-knit force of warriors who fought for each other now began to show signs of fracture. Discontent spread like wildfire through the ranks, fueled by the growing realization that something had shifted within the very heart of their leader. They were no longer fighting for a king who represented their collective strength. They were fighting for a king who was, in their eyes, losing touch with reality. The kingdom was not immune to the consequences of Shaka's unraveling mind. As the whispers grew, so did the signs of unrest. There were murmurs in the villages, rumors of dissatisfaction, stories of people beginning to question the very authority of their king. The fear that once held the people together now felt more like a weight, a burden they were no longer willing to bear. There were murmurs that Shaka's reign had grown too harsh, that the sacrifices demanded of them had become too great. His wars of expansion had left their homes and families in ruin, and his obsession with power seemed to push them into a future they were no longer sure they wanted. What had once been a united kingdom now began to crack at the edges. Those who had once been loyal to Shaka now stood at a crossroads. The vision of a united Zulu nation had been clouded by the king's personal demons. What had been a force of incredible unity now teetered on the brink of disarray, and the future seemed uncertain. It wasn't just a handful of generals or advisors anymore. The dissent was spreading to the very heart of the kingdom, and soon, those who had once been Shaka's closest allies would find themselves forced to choose, remain loyal to a king who was no longer the man they had once followed, or stand against him and risk everything they had built. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and they were beginning to take root. The quiet dissent among Shaka's generals began to grow louder, their dissatisfaction becoming more open. The men who had once stood by his side were now questioning his decisions, questioning his leadership. They began to see in him something that they had not seen before, a man whose grip on the empire was slipping, a man whose vision had become clouded by his own obsession with power and control. The stories of rebellion began to circulate. It wasn't just the warriors anymore. The people began to talk, their once voiceless discontent now taking shape. Shaka's power, once so secure, now seemed fragile. The cracks in the empire were widening, and the whispers of rebellion grew into an undeniable chorus. What had once been an unshakable rule, built on trust, loyalty, and unity, was now on the verge of collapse. The empire that had once been a symbol of strength and unity was now staring down the prospect of its own downfall. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and there was no turning back. The growing sense of dissatisfaction, the rise of dissent within Shaka's own ranks, would be the spark that lit the fire of rebellion, and no one could say what the final outcome would be. The air in the royal court had changed. Where once it was filled with respect, power, and the hum of loyalty, now it crackled with tension, distrust, and whispers in the shadows. The great king, Shaka, once the unchallenged force that had united the Zulu people, now found himself surrounded by the very men who had helped him build his empire. The men who had followed him through blood and fire. They had once been brothers, but now they stood as strangers, their hearts hardened by the distance that had grown between them and their king. The cracks had formed slowly at first, barely noticeable. Shaka's obsession with power, his grief and paranoia, had driven a wedge between him and the very people who had sworn allegiance to him. His temper had grown more erratic, his commands more demanding, and his judgment clouded by the weight of his own fears. There was no room for questioning him, no room for doubt. Shaka, once a man who inspired awe, now inspired fear, and that fear began to change into something far darker. At first, the discontent was quiet. His generals, his most trusted advisors, spoke in hushed tones, questioning the king's decisions, his sanity, his ability to lead. It was only in the private chambers, away from the prying eyes of the court, that the true nature of the unrest began to take shape. Old friends, once inseparable from Shaka, now found themselves on opposite sides of a growing divide. The king's increasing cruelty had alienated those who had stood by him. The men who had once given their lives for him now felt the sting of betrayal, and they knew that something had to change. The conspiracies began to take root in secret. The very men who had helped him conquer kingdoms, build empires, and shape history now plotted his downfall. Each meeting, each whisper, was a small step toward the inevitable. They could no longer ignore the truth. Shaka, in his quest for absolute power, had pushed them too far. He had become a tyrant in their eyes, a man they could no longer follow, a man who no longer cared for the kingdom, only for his own survival. It wasn't just the generals, though. The people began to feel it too. What had once been a kingdom that rallied behind Shaka's vision now found itself divided. The leaders were fractured, and the power of the throne seemed weaker with each passing day. The once untouchable king was no longer feared in the way he once had been. The whispers outside the royal court grew louder, and Shaka's reign, once so certain, now felt fragile. The court that had once been a place of strength, filled with men of great valor and vision, now became a breeding ground for plots and betrayal. No one was safe, not even the king himself. Those who had once sworn loyalty to him now stood in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. The conspiracy was not just an act of revenge or rebellion, it was survival. Shaka's reign had grown intolerable, and the only way out was through darkness. As the whispers grew into something more tangible, so did the tension. Shaka, ever the vigilant king, felt the shift. He knew something was amiss, but he couldn't grasp the full scope of what was happening behind closed doors. The men he trusted, the men he had fought beside, were no longer the allies they once had been. Every glance from a former friend felt like a dagger, every word spoken too carefully, too cautiously. Paranoia seeped into his every thought, and though he could feel the walls closing in around him, he had no idea how close he was to the edge. The days became longer, the nights colder, and the palace, once a place of power, now felt like a prison. The conspiracy was no longer a secret, the assassins had already made their plans. They had waited long enough, biding their time, waiting for Shaka to slip just enough to make their move. The king had pushed them too far, and now there was no turning back. One by one, those closest to him had turned against him. The men who had once fought with him, laughed with him, and celebrated his victories now stood as silent witnesses to his downfall. The conspirators, knowing their fate if they were discovered, operated in the shadows, moving like ghosts through the royal halls. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, as though the palace itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The night of Shaka's assassination came like a storm. It was swift, sudden, and brutal, like the strike of a viper. The conspirators moved as one, their knives sharp, their resolve unshakable. The king had made his final mistake, and now it was too late to stop what was coming. His own men, his own family, turned against him, and with a single blow, Shaka's reign came to an end. It was a death as brutal as the man himself, but in the end, it was not just Shaka who fell. The empire he had built, the empire that had been so full of promise, so full of strength, began to crumble with his death. The seeds of rebellion, once just whispers, had grown into something unstoppable. Shaka's vision, once so clear, had been clouded by his own demons, and in the end, it was those demons that had brought him down. And in the quiet that followed, as the court stood in stunned silence, the empire realized that the king was gone. The man who had shaped their world, for better or worse, had been silenced. The conspirators vanished into the night, their task complete, but the kingdom they left behind would never be the same. Shaka's death marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of something else, an uncertain future for the Zulu people, a future shaped by the very power struggles and betrayals that had led to their king's death. And as the stories of Shaka's life and death were passed down, they would take on a mythic quality, forever intertwined with the tale of a king who had risen so high, only to fall so far. The night was still. The palace, once a place of power and grandeur, felt like a tomb. The cold, quiet air carried with it a weight so heavy that it almost seemed to press down on the earth itself. Inside the walls of the royal chambers, something dark stirred. It wasn't just the usual tension of an empire, or the unease that comes with the shifting of power. No, this was something different, something final. Shaka had no idea that the end was so near. The whispers, the betrayal, the plots, he had felt them growing around him, yet he had never imagined it would come like this. It was not the enemies who had stood before him in battle, the ones he had crushed with his might, who would bring his downfall. No, it was his own blood. His own brothers. The conspirators, hidden in plain sight, had waited for the perfect moment. The cracks in Shaka's rule had become too wide, too obvious. His temper had flared too often, his cruelty too pronounced, and those who had once followed him blindly could no longer bear the weight of his madness. Among them were his half-brothers, who had once looked up to him as a king, as a protector. But now, they had become the very hands that would end his reign. In the darkness of the night, the brothers crept into Shaka's private quarters. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just the cold precision of their actions. They had been preparing for this moment for so long, rehearsing their silence, their timing, their resolve. They knew what had to be done, and in that moment, as they closed in on their brother, there was no turning back. It was swift. A strike, a whisper of betrayal, and the king who had conquered so much, who had risen to the height of power, was no more. Shaka, the great king of the Zulu, the man who had crushed kingdoms and shaped the destiny of his people, lay dead. His half-brothers had taken the final step in a story that had been building for years. His fall was sudden, brutal, but in the end, it was inevitable. But in the silence that followed, something strange began to happen. The death of Shaka was not just the fall of a man, it was the beginning of something more. His life, his reign, and his death would transcend time itself. Shaka, once a man of flesh and bone, would become something else entirely, a legend, a force that would echo through the generations. And so, the story of Shaka's death began to take on a life of its own. Whispers began to spread like wildfire, not just of his violent end, but of something greater. To the people, Shaka's death was not an end, it was a transition, a passage from the mortal world into something eternal. The king who had been a force of nature, who had reshaped the world around him, could not simply fade into nothing. No, he had become something more than a man, he had become a god. The stories that followed painted his death as a sacred event, a moment when the earth itself had bowed to Shaka's greatness. Some said that he had been taken by the gods, that his soul had been called to a higher plane, to join the ancestors he had fought so fiercely to protect. Others whispered that Shaka's death had been the beginning of his immortality, that his spirit would live on, not just in the hearts of his people, but in the very soil they walked upon. His half-brothers, the ones who had dealt the fatal blow, became ghosts in the eyes of the people. They were no longer just men, they were the betrayers of a legend, and their names would never be spoken without fear. Shaka's death had cast a shadow over them that would last forever. The people would remember the king, not for his end, but for what he had become after his death, a symbol, a myth, a god. The myths surrounding Shaka's death grew with every telling. Some said that the moment his heart stopped beating, a storm had swept across the land, as though the heavens themselves had wept for the loss of such a mighty king. Others claimed that the stars in the sky had dimmed for a night, as though even the universe had mourned his passing. And still, others spoke of the animals that roamed the earth, which seemed to bow their heads in respect at his death. The world had shifted, and Shaka's presence could still be felt in every blade of grass, every gust of wind, every flash of lightning. The Zulu people did not just mourn the loss of their king, they celebrated it. For in their hearts, Shaka was not gone. His death was a powerful transformation, a turning of the page in a story that would never end. His memory would be etched into the very fabric of their history, and his legacy would be passed down from one generation to the next. The great Shaka had died, but his spirit had not been vanquished. The myths of his death would only grow, becoming more powerful with each retelling. His name would live on, carried by the voices of those who would speak it with reverence, and those who would remember him as the king who had risen from nothing to create an empire that shook the world. As the years passed, Shaka's death became more than just a memory, it became a part of the land itself. His story would be told around campfires, in the hearts of warriors, in the songs of mothers, and in the prayers of those who sought to understand his legacy. And in every telling, Shaka would not just be a man who had lived and died. He would be a force, an immortal presence whose story would never fade. The people of the Zulu nation had lost their king, but in his death, they had found something even greater, a legend that would endure, a myth that would carry them forward. And so, Shaka's assassination, as brutal and tragic as it had been, would never be the end. It would only be the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that would stretch through time, unbroken, eternal. The world felt strangely quiet after the king's blood had been spilled. The weight of his death hung thick in the air, and the Zulu kingdom, once so full of energy and purpose, seemed to tremble under its own shadow. The heart of the empire had been cut out, and though life continued, it was as if the land itself had paused to consider what had just happened. Shaka was gone. The man who had built the Zulu into a force that shook the continent, who had carved a path through the chaos with unmatched vision and unrelenting will, had been brought low not by a rival's spear but by betrayal within his own walls. The echoes of his assassination rippled outward, and with them came uncertainty, a creeping, consuming doubt about what would come next. The news of Shaka's death spread like wildfire, and with it came chaos. The Zulu kingdom, so carefully structured under his iron rule, was suddenly a realm without an anchor. The people who had looked to him for guidance, who had trusted in his strength, found themselves staring into a future that seemed darker and more dangerous than any battlefield they had ever faced. For a kingdom forged in conquest, the idea of peace had always been foreign, but now, even the unity they had known felt fragile. In the immediate wake of his death, there was no celebration among his assassins. Shaka's half-brothers, Dingaan and Mlangana, had taken the throne, but the weight of what they had done pressed heavily on their shoulders. They had rid themselves of the man who had inspired both awe and fear, but in doing so, they had opened a door to a storm they could not control. Shaka had been a man of contradictions, a visionary and a tyrant, a protector and a destroyer, and in his absence, the kingdom was left to navigate the chaos he had left behind. The struggles began almost immediately. The succession was anything but smooth, as the power vacuum created by Shaka's death invited conflict at every level. Generals who had once been loyal to Shaka now found themselves questioning the new rulers. The intricate web of alliances that Shaka had maintained began to fray, and the bonds that had held the Zulu kingdom together were tested in ways they had never been before. Factions arose, each with its own vision of what the kingdom should become, and the unity that had been Shaka's greatest achievement started to slip away. Among the people, grief and fear mingled in equal measure. Shaka's death was not just the loss of a king, it was the loss of certainty, of direction. He had been more than a ruler, he had been a symbol of what the Zulu could achieve. His vision, his drive, and his relentless pursuit of power had defined the kingdom, and without him, it was as if the ground beneath their feet had shifted. The people whispered of omens, of signs that Shaka's spirit had not yet departed, and of the punishment that might come for those who had betrayed him. Dingaan, who now claimed the throne, faced a kingdom that was more divided than ever. He tried to consolidate his power, but he lacked the charisma and sheer force of will that Shaka had wielded so effortlessly. His rule was marked by paranoia and mistrust, as he sought to stamp out any potential threats to his authority. The kingdom that Shaka had built through fire and blood now seemed on the verge of crumbling under the weight of its own uncertainty. Even as Dingaan struggled to establish his rule, external threats loomed large. The Zulus' rivals, long held at bay by Shaka's unyielding might, saw an opportunity in the chaos. Neighboring tribes, sensing weakness, began to test the borders, probing for signs of vulnerability. The Europeans, whose influence had been carefully managed during Shaka's reign, now found new ways to insert themselves into the kingdom's affairs. The delicate balance that Shaka had maintained was gone, and with it came a flood of challenges that threatened to drown the Zulu kingdom. Within the royal court, the atmosphere was one of distrust and fear. Those who had once stood at Shaka's side now found themselves navigating a treacherous landscape where loyalty was questioned, and betrayal seemed to lurk around every corner. The court, which had been a place of strength and unity under Shaka's rule, had become a battleground for competing interests. The generals, advisors, and spiritual leaders who had once worked together now found themselves at odds, each vying for influence in a kingdom that seemed to be unraveling. The people, too, felt the strain of this new reality. Shaka's death had left them without the unifying force that had given them purpose, and the cracks in the kingdom began to show. Resources became scarcer, and the once mighty Zulu armies struggled to maintain their dominance. The land, which had seemed so full of promise under Shaka's rule, now felt like a place of uncertainty and struggle. And yet, amid the chaos, there were those who held on to Shaka's legacy. His name, his memory, and his vision continued to inspire, even in the darkest moments. The myths surrounding his life and death grew, becoming a source of strength for those who sought to preserve what he had built. Shaka had been more than a man, he had been an idea, a force that could not be extinguished by his death. His spirit lived on in the hearts of his people, in the stories they told, and in the land they fought to protect. As the kingdom struggled to find its footing, the shadow of Shaka loomed large. His death had changed everything, but it had also left a legacy that could not be ignored. The Zulu kingdom, for all its challenges, remained a force to be reckoned with, shaped by the man who had brought it into being. The road ahead was uncertain, but the spirit of Shaka, the legend of his life and death, would continue to guide them through the storm. It is said that the wind carries whispers of Shaka's name, moving through the valleys and across the great plains of the Zulu lands. On nights when the stars shine fiercely, some swear they can feel his gaze, watchful, steady, and unyielding. The spirit of the great king, they say, is not bound by death. Instead, he walks among the ancestors, a silent guardian over the nation he carved from chaos. The elders tell tales of Shaka's spirit, not as a ghost haunting the living, but as a presence rooted in the earth and sky, as eternal as the mountains. His energy is woven into the very fabric of the Zulu people's lives. They say that in moments of dire need, when the kingdom teeters on the brink of disaster, his spirit awakens. He is not seen in form, but felt in the rise of courage, the swelling of resolve, and the whispers of strategies that seem to appear from nowhere. There was a time, not long after his death, when famine once again gripped the land. The crops withered, the cattle grew thin, and despair hung like a heavy fog. It was during one of these bleak nights that an elder claimed to have seen Shaka in a dream. The king stood tall, his figure outlined by a pale light, his expression fierce yet comforting. He did not speak, but his presence was enough to ignite a fire in the hearts of those who had begun to lose hope. The next morning, the elders called a gathering, and with a renewed sense of purpose, the people dug deeper, searched farther, and worked harder. The rains came soon after, and to this day, they believe it was Shaka's will that brought them relief. The myths surrounding Shaka's return often carry a sense of foreboding as well as hope. He is not a spirit to be invoked lightly. His return is seen as a sign of great upheaval, of a time when the Zulu must unite or perish. Some say he appears in dreams to warriors, offering visions of victory or warning them of danger. Others claim to have seen him in the form of a great bull, a symbol of strength and resilience, standing at the edge of a battlefield or near a village in distress. There are darker stories too, tales of how his spirit can bring wrath upon those who betray their own people. A soldier once boasted of his treachery against his comrades, and not long after, he fell ill. The healers, perplexed by his condition, declared that he was cursed. The villagers whispered that it was Shaka's judgment, his silent way of ensuring that loyalty to the Zulu nation remained sacred. Children grow up hearing these tales, their young minds painting vivid pictures of Shaka's spirit watching over them. When thunder rumbles in the distance, they are told it is Shaka's voice, reminding them to be strong and steadfast. When a warrior survives a near impossible battle, it is said that Shaka himself guided their blade. His spirit is both a comfort and a warning, a reminder of the greatness that the Zulu people are capable of and the consequences of straying from their path. As the years passed, the stories grew more elaborate, blending history with legend. Some say Shaka's spirit resides in a sacred grove, hidden deep within the heart of Zululand. The grove is said to be a place where time stands still, where the air hums with his energy. Only the worthy, those with pure hearts and unwavering dedication to the Zulu nation, can find it. Those who do are said to emerge changed, their minds clearer and their hearts stronger, carrying a piece of Shaka's wisdom back to their people. The myths do not paint him as a perfect figure. They acknowledge his temper, his ruthlessness, and his flaws. But they also portray him as a leader who cared deeply for his people, whose spirit endures because his love for the Zulu nation was unbreakable. His presence in their folklore is not just a reminder of who he was, but a symbol of the Zulus' enduring spirit. Shaka's story becomes their story, a testament to resilience, unity, and the unyielding pursuit of greatness. Even now, in the modern era, the stories persist. Some laugh them off as superstition, but others hold them close, finding strength in the idea that Shaka is still with them. During times of political unrest or national celebration, his name is invoked with reverence. Leaders seeking guidance call upon his spirit, not in rituals or ceremonies, but in the quiet moments when decisions weigh heavy. It is not uncommon for an elder to murmur, "Remember Shaka," as a way of reminding the young to think boldly, act decisively, and never forget the sacrifices of the past. Perhaps the most powerful of the myths is the one that speaks of his ultimate return. They say that one day, when the Zulu nation faces its greatest challenge, Shaka will rise again, not as a mortal man, but as a force that will inspire and lead. It will not be his body that returns, but his spirit, burning brighter than ever, rallying his people with the same fierce determination that built an empire. On quiet nights, when the fires burn low and the stars shimmer like ancient memories, the elders gather the children close and tell them these stories. They speak of a man who was more than a king, a leader who became a legend, and a legend who became a part of the land itself. As the children listen, wide-eyed and breathless, they come to understand that Shaka's spirit is not just a relic of the past. It is a promise, a reminder that greatness is not just inherited but created, nurtured, and fought for. And so, the circle of stories continues, each generation adding their voice to the enduring song of Shaka, the spirit of the Zulu. The ink of foreign pens has both illuminated and obscured the figure of Shaka Zulu, leaving behind a patchwork of impressions, glimpses of a man both revered and feared. For those who encountered him through the eyes of European traders, missionaries, and colonial officials, Shaka was an enigma, a force of nature, a riddle carved in flesh and blood. Their accounts often carried the weight of their own prejudices, their own fears, their own awe, creating a tapestry where truth and fiction were tightly woven. One cannot ignore the power of the words penned by early visitors. To some, Shaka was a towering figure of genius, a leader who reshaped the destiny of an entire people with the sharp edge of innovation and the iron will of his spirit. These accounts painted him as a visionary, a king who ruled not just with authority but with an unmatched understanding of strategy, warfare, and governance. In their admiration, they likened him to the great rulers of Europe, a man whose intellect and ambition could rival any monarch across the seas. But admiration, in the hands of those who did not fully understand his world, was often tinged with fear. For every word that celebrated his brilliance, there were others that cast him as a tyrant, a man consumed by power, whose methods were as brutal as they were effective. These tales spoke of rivers running red with the blood of his enemies, of lands emptied by his wars, and of a leader whose ruthlessness knew no bounds. To some Europeans, Shaka was not just a man but a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of the untamed and unknowable Africa they sought to conquer. Missionaries who arrived with their faith and their books found themselves both awed and horrified by what they encountered. Their journals, filled with descriptions of Zulu culture, often highlighted the grandeur of Shaka's court, the discipline of his warriors, and the unyielding loyalty he inspired. But these same pages dripped with judgments, filtered through the lens of their own beliefs. Shaka's reverence for the ancestors, his rituals, his laws, these were seen not as the foundations of a thriving society but as evidence of a people needing salvation. The romanticization of Shaka often clashed with his demonization. Some accounts painted him as a tragic hero, a figure destined for greatness but undone by his own humanity. They spoke of his grief for his mother Nandi, his relentless pursuit of a vision that consumed him, and the loneliness of a king who stood above all others. These narratives, crafted with a mix of admiration and condescension, reflected more about the storytellers than the man himself. They projected their own ideals and fears onto Shaka, shaping him into a character who could fit their tales of empire and conquest. The stories of Shaka that reached Europe were sometimes larger than life, embellished with details that blurred the line between reality and myth. Traders and officials, eager to impress their audiences back home, spun tales of a warrior king whose very presence could command armies and whose gaze could strike fear into the bravest hearts. These tales, while captivating, often ignored the complexities of Shaka's rule, reducing him to a caricature, a savage genius, a noble barbarian. Yet, amidst the distortions and exaggerations, fragments of truth shone through. The record spoke of a man who transformed the art of war, who united fractious tribes into a single, formidable nation. They acknowledged his charisma, his intelligence, and his unshakable determination. Even as they painted him as a threat, they could not deny his greatness. The clash of worldviews was evident in every word written about him. For the Zulu, Shaka was a leader who embodied their hopes and fears, a man who carried their destiny on his shoulders. For the Europeans, he was both a marvel and a menace, a figure who defied their expectations and challenged their narratives. His existence disrupted their tidy stories of civilization and savagery, forcing them to confront a reality that was far more complex than they had imagined. Even now, the legacy of these accounts lingers, shaping how the world remembers Shaka. He is both hero and villain, a symbol of resistance and a cautionary tale, a man whose story is told and retold through the filters of those who seek to understand or exploit his legend. But for the Zulu people, Shaka's story is not one of distortion or debate. It is a living truth, a legacy carried in their blood, their land, and their spirit. The myths created by outsiders may cast long shadows, but they cannot eclipse the light of the man himself. His essence endures, not in the pages of colonial records, but in the hearts of his people, where his name is spoken with pride, his deeds remembered with reverence, and his spirit felt in every battle fought, every victory won, and every step taken toward the future he once dreamed of. And as the stories continue to ripple through time, one cannot help but wonder, what would Shaka have thought of these accounts? Would he have laughed at their absurdities, raged at their inaccuracies, or simply shrugged, knowing that his true legacy lies not in the words of strangers but in the enduring strength of the Zulu nation? The answer, like so much about Shaka, remains a mystery, one that keeps the fire of his legend burning bright. The clang of shields echoed through the ages, the relentless rhythm of disciplined feet pounding the earth, a beat that once set the pulse of an empire. Long after Shaka's voice fell silent, his vision thundered on, carving a legacy in the very soil of African history. His military innovations were more than tools of conquest. They were a language, a philosophy, a declaration of the power and potential of a united people. The Ikwa, his revolutionary short-stabbing spear, remains a symbol of transformation, not just in warfare but in thought. In Shaka's hands, it was more than a weapon, it was the promise of adaptability and precision. This spear, with its shortened shaft and razor-sharp blade, required warriors to step closer, to look into the eyes of their foes, to make war a deeply personal act. That demand for courage, for intimacy in battle, echoed far beyond the battlefield, shaping the character of the men who wielded it. The bullhorn formation, a brilliant orchestration of chaos and control, rewrote the rules of engagement. This strategy, dividing warriors into the chest, horns, and loins of an imagined beast, allowed the Zulu army to envelop their enemies with precision and ferocity. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a statement, a testament to Shaka's genius for using unity and discipline to turn the tides of conflict. Even as modern armies rose, echoes of Shaka's strategies could be seen in their maneuvers, his influence bleeding into battlefields continents away. Shaka's drills, the grueling training regimens he imposed, forged warriors as much in spirit as in skill. He demanded endurance, loyalty, and an unbreakable bond with the collective. The spirit of those warriors, molded in sweat and discipline, became a standard for unity. These practices didn't fade with the Zulu kingdom's shifts, they lingered, a quiet whisper in the hearts of leaders and revolutionaries who sought to organize their people in the fight for freedom. But his impact stretched far beyond the art of war. Shaka redefined leadership, showing the world what it meant to lead not just with authority but with vision. He turned a fragmented array of clans into a formidable nation, proving that strength lay in unity, that the ties of culture and identity could bind people stronger than chains. Leaders across Africa and beyond found inspiration in his story, carrying his ideals into their struggles, shaping their quests for liberation and self-determination. The colonial powers, seeking to erase what they could not understand, often underestimated Shaka's legacy. But the seeds he planted were too deeply rooted. Across Africa, in whispers and in songs, his name became a rallying cry, his methods a source of inspiration. Movements that rose to challenge oppression carried echoes of Shaka's unyielding spirit, his vision of a people bound together in purpose and strength. Even beyond Africa, Shaka's legacy rippled outward. Historians, strategists, and thinkers studied his innovations, his leadership, his transformative power. His story became a lens through which the world began to understand the complexity and resilience of African societies. He was no longer just a figure of the past, he was a testament to the ingenuity and brilliance that colonial narratives had long tried to suppress. Shaka's influence was not confined to history books or battlefields, it lived in the myths, the songs, the hearts of those who remembered. He became a symbol of what could be achieved when a people united, a figure who transcended the boundaries of time and space. His spirit, fierce and unyielding, seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that greatness is not measured by the span of a lifetime, but by the depth of one's impact. Generations later, the stories of his reign still stirred something primal, something powerful. To many, Shaka was more than a king, more than a warrior, he was a force of nature, an idea that refused to fade. His enduring influence spoke not just to what he had achieved, but to the strength and resilience of the people he had inspired. The Zulu nation, though shaped by centuries of change, carried his spirit forward, each step a testament to the vision of a man who dared to dream of unity and power in a fractured world. And in those moments when history seemed to echo back, when leaders stood on the precipice of change or conflict, it was as if Shaka's presence could be felt once more. His innovations, his ideals, his relentless pursuit of greatness, they were never truly his alone. They belonged to the people, to the land, to the world that continued to draw strength from his memory. The flame of Shaka's influence burned on, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Each spark lit by his legacy promised something more, something unbroken, something eternal. The firelight flickered against the rough walls of the hut, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed alive with whispers of old stories. Around the circle, the elders spoke, their voices low but resonant, weaving tales that had been told for generations. In their words, Shaka was not merely a man but something more, an unstoppable force, a tempest, a being touched by the gods. The truth, if it existed somewhere in the labyrinth of time, was nearly drowned beneath the weight of legend. Shaka's name carried a gravity that could silence rooms and ignite passions. Was he the bloodthirsty tyrant described in some accounts, or the visionary leader who carved a kingdom from chaos? The truth seemed to shimmer like a mirage, slipping through fingers the moment it felt within reach. Yet the stories persisted, each one more vivid, more exaggerated than the last, reshaping him into a figure who stood somewhere between mortal and myth. The myths painted him as invincible, his presence alone enough to command armies and terrify enemies into submission. They spoke of a man who could stare down the wildest beasts, whose very breath could summon storms. There were tales of his supernatural connection to the earth, how he could feel its pulse, predicting movements of armies like a hawk spotting prey from the skies. These were not the stories of a man, they were the stories of a legend, designed to evoke awe and fear, to make him untouchable even in death. But beneath the layers of embellishment, there was a man. A man who bled, who grieved, who faced betrayal and loss. The myth would have him stride across the land like a colossus, unbothered by the frailties of existence. The reality was more complicated, a young boy ostracized for his illegitimacy, driven by a hunger for recognition, rising through ingenuity and determination. The myth glorified his power, the truth revealed the weight of carrying it. The legend of Shaka wielded power of its own, shaping perceptions and actions long after his death. His enemies demonized him, painting him as a monster who reveled in violence. European accounts, often tainted by fear and misunderstanding, described him as a despot, a man consumed by madness. To them, he was a convenient symbol of the so-called savagery they sought to civilize. These accounts swelled with sensationalism, turning battles into bloodbaths, discipline into cruelty, and strategy into barbarism. Yet, in the hearts of his people, Shaka was something else entirely. He was the one who had lifted them from obscurity, uniting them under a single banner, giving them a pride they hadn't known before. His name became a chant on their lips, a talisman against despair. For every story of his wrath, there was another of his brilliance, his foresight, his unrelenting commitment to the strength of his people. The myths weren't mere exaggerations, they were tools, weapons in the battle for memory. Shaka's enemies used them to vilify him, to justify their conquests. His people used them to immortalize him, to ensure that his name would never be forgotten. The myth, like a blade, could cut both ways. And then there were the moments that blurred the line between reality and legend, events so extraordinary that they defied simple explanation. The night of his mother Nandi's death, when he commanded the kingdom to stop planting crops, to mourn as if the land itself had lost its soul, was that madness, or was it the act of a man so consumed by grief that he wanted the world to mirror his pain? To some, it was tyranny, to others, it was evidence of a heart too vast to contain its sorrow. The myths often erased the humanity of Shaka, turning him into either a monster or a god. The reality was far more compelling. He was a leader who understood the weight of his decisions, a man who knew the price of power. His innovations, his strategies, his reforms, they were not the work of a mythical figure, but of a mind that refused to accept limitations. He saw a future that others could not, and he pursued it with a fervor that left no room for hesitation. The power of myth lay not in its accuracy but in its ability to endure, to inspire, to shape how generations remembered the past. Myths wrapped Shaka in a cloak of immortality, ensuring that his name would echo through the ages, not as a mere historical figure, but as a symbol of resilience, ambition, and transformation. The truth of who he was, his flaws, his fears, his dreams, was often lost in the stories. But perhaps that was the point. Myths are not meant to preserve reality, they are meant to preserve meaning. And so, Shaka remained both man and myth, his legacy carved into the land, the people, the very air they breathed. The firelight flickered, the elders' voices softened, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch out, carrying his story into the night. The horizon stretched wide, where the sun's golden rays kissed the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal, bathing the land in a glow that seemed eternal. To stand here was to feel the pulse of history itself, a rhythm that echoed through the wind, whispering of battles won, losses mourned, and a legacy that refused to fade. This was Zulu land, not just a kingdom but a spirit that endured through the centuries, shaped and reshaped, yet always alive. After Shaka's death, the Zulu kingdom faced a world spinning faster than ever before. His rule had set a foundation, one built with the sweat, blood, and dreams of a people who had dared to believe in their strength. But time moved forward relentlessly, bringing with it new challenges and transformations. The land that Shaka had unified did not stay untouched by the forces of colonization, modernization, and struggle. The kingdom, once bound together by a singular, towering figure, found itself pulled in many directions. Leadership changed hands, alliances were forged and broken. Yet, through it all, the spirit of Shaka lingered, as if his vision had been etched into the very soil. Every leader who followed carried a part of his shadow, whether they wished to or not, their actions weighed against his legend. Colonial powers arrived with their own dreams, dreams that often spelled nightmare for the Zulu people. The land of warriors and chiefs became a battleground, its soil soaked not only with rain but with the blood of those who refused to bow. Shaka's name, invoked by those who resisted, became a rallying cry. Even as the Zulu kingdom's political power waned, the essence of what it stood for, resilience, pride, and identity, remained unbroken. As South Africa moved toward the tumultuous years of apartheid, the memory of Shaka took on a new dimension. He was no longer just a king, he became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that the Zulu people had once stood tall, unyielding in the face of impossible odds. For those seeking to reclaim their dignity in a system designed to strip it away, Shaka's legacy was a beacon, a reminder of what could be achieved with unity and vision. Modern times brought new faces to the Zulu narrative. Leaders emerged who sought to balance tradition with progress, to honor the past while navigating an uncertain future. The kingdom itself transformed, becoming not just a political entity but a cultural one, a source of pride for millions of South Africans. Ceremonies, festivals, and oral traditions kept the memory of Shaka alive, ensuring that his story was not confined to dusty history books but lived on in the hearts and minds of the people. The world watched as South Africa underwent seismic shifts, from the grip of apartheid to the promise of democracy. In this new chapter, the Zulu nation played its part, contributing to the rich, complex tapestry of a country seeking to heal. Through it all, Shaka's influence could be felt, not in the clash of spears, but in the quiet strength of a people who knew their worth. KwaZulu-Natal, the land Shaka once walked, became a symbol of this balance between past and present. Its cities hummed with life, its fields stretched wide, and its people carried stories of a king who had dared to dream beyond the horizon. The transformation was undeniable, yet the connection to history remained palpable, as if the land itself remembered. And then there was the global stage, where Shaka's legacy reached far beyond the borders of his kingdom. His military strategies were studied, his leadership admired, his story told in countless forms. For the world, Shaka was not just a Zulu king, he was a figure who transcended time and place, a testament to the power of vision and courage. From academic halls to cultural celebrations, his name carried a weight that could not be ignored. But to the Zulu people, he was more than a symbol. He was theirs, a part of their blood, their stories, their identity. Every child who heard tales of his deeds, every elder who spoke of his wisdom, every warrior who marched with pride, they all carried a piece of him forward. The Zulu nation, in all its modern complexity, stood as proof that Shaka's spirit had never truly left. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the hills, as if the land itself was bowing in respect. The transformation of the Zulu kingdom was not just a story of change, but of survival, of a legacy that adapted yet stayed true to its core. And as the wind carried the faintest echoes of an ancient song, it seemed to say that the story was not yet over. There were still pages to be written, still battles to be fought, not with spears, but with unity, vision, and an unyielding belief in what the Zulu people could achieve. The fire crackled under the vast, star-strewn sky, casting flickering shadows on the faces gathered in a tight circle. An elder's voice, withered and commanding, rose above the whispers of the night, weaving a story as ancient as the soil beneath their feet. It was not just a tale, but a thread binding generations, a memory passed from parent to child, as alive now as it was centuries ago. It was the story of Shaka, a warrior, king, and the heart of a nation. To those listening, he was more than a historical figure. In the warmth of the firelight, he became a vivid presence, his footsteps echoing in the rhythm of their heartbeat. The elder's voice carried them back to a time when the land quivered under the weight of his power, his spear slicing not just through enemies but through the very fabric of history. And as the story unfolded, so too did the layers of Shaka's spirit, his legacy taking form in the myths that defined him. There is a story, they say, of the way Shaka's voice could command the rain to fall and the winds to still, as if even nature dared not defy him. In the retelling, his words were imbued with a force that could calm tempests or summon storms. To the Zulu people, this was not just metaphor, it was a reflection of his ability to shape destiny itself, to make the impossible seem inevitable. Songs sung in his honor carried the weight of triumphs and sacrifices. These melodies, echoing through valleys and fields, spoke of battles fought with unyielding courage and of victories that seemed to split the sky. Each note was a tribute to his leadership, each lyric a testament to the blood spilled for the dream of unity. The songs, rich with metaphor, described how his spear danced like lightning, how his warriors moved as one, an unstoppable wave of purpose and pride. But the tales did not shy away from his complexities. There were stories of his grief, of a man brought low by the death of his beloved mother. These were not whispers of weakness, but rather hymns of his humanity. They reminded the listeners that even the strongest hearts could break, that even Shaka, who had forged an empire, was a son who mourned, a man whose tears could flood the rivers. Artifacts, too, held his essence. The spears, shields, and beadwork preserved in families across the land spoke in a language older than words. Each pattern told a story, each design a piece of a larger mosaic that celebrated the king who had once carried his people into a new era. These objects, displayed in ceremonies or cherished in private, became bridges to a past that refused to be forgotten. And then there were the riddles, woven into the folklore, that danced around the edges of his legacy. Was it true, some wondered, that Shaka's shadow could still be seen on the battlefield under the full moon, a silent guardian watching over his descendants? Others spoke of a mysterious bird, black as night, that soared above his burial site, its cries echoing like a warning or a blessing. The modern retellings did not merely glorify him, they engaged in a conversation with the past, blending fact and imagination in ways that reflected the changing needs of the people. These stories, told in schools, performed on stages, and immortalized in art, brought Shaka into the present. They became a way to wrestle with identity, to find pride in heritage, and to challenge the erasure of history. Even as time moved forward, the tales grew richer, not weaker. Children learned them not just as history lessons, but as moral compasses, lessons in leadership, resilience, and the cost of ambition. Elders, in sharing these stories, ensured that the heartbeat of their culture continued, each telling a thread in the ever-expanding tapestry of who they were and who they could become. And so, as the fire burned low and the elder's voice softened, the circle sat in hushed reverence. For in those stories, they had not only met a king but glimpsed the soul of a people. Shaka was not merely a figure of the past, he was a force that lived on in the songs they sang, the artifacts they held, and the stories they would one day tell their own children. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird cried out, its song carrying into the darkness. It felt, for a moment, like the echoes of a drumbeat, the faintest pulse of a legacy that would never die. And as the listeners dispersed, their steps soft against the earth, they carried with them not just the weight of the stories, but the promise that the legend would continue. For Shaka's spirit, as alive in their hearts as in the tales they shared, was never meant to rest, it was meant to inspire. The screen flickers to life, the music swelling with intensity. A lone figure steps forward, his gaze piercing, his silhouette framed by the vast African plains stretching endlessly behind him. His stance commands attention, a force of nature captured in flesh and blood. This is Shaka, the king, warrior, enigma. For decades, his story has been etched onto pages, brought to life on screens, and whispered through airwaves. Each portrayal a mirror reflecting not only his life, but the questions humanity asks of power, ambition, and destiny. Books have painted him in broad strokes, sometimes a savior, other times a specter of fear. In their pages, Shaka emerges not merely as a man but as a myth. Some authors, drawn to his military genius, depict him as a leader who wielded strategy like a sharpened blade, his intellect cutting through chaos to forge a unified kingdom. They write of his revolutionary tactics, of shields and spears, of warriors moving as one, unstoppable. Others, however, focus on the shadow of his power, the paranoia that crept into his reign, the ruthlessness that defined his rule. In these accounts, he looms larger than life, a figure who inspires awe but leaves a chill in his wake. Film and television have brought him to new generations, each frame laden with the weight of his legend. In some productions, he is the hero of an epic saga, his rise a tale of resilience and brilliance. The audience is drawn to his courage, his ability to turn adversity into strength, to transform a fragmented land into a formidable empire. The camera lingers on his moments of triumph, the swelling of pride in his people, the quiet resolve in his eyes. Yet, there are other films where the lens sharpens its focus on his darker facets. These portrayals delve into his unrelenting thirst for control, his descent into suspicion, and the brutal measures he employed to maintain order. These stories do not shy away from the blood on his hands, showing a ruler whose greatness was as much a product of fear as it was of respect. The audience is left torn, caught between admiration and unease, the lines between hero and tyrant blurred beyond recognition. Songs and theater add another layer to his legacy, their performances pulsating with emotion. In music, his name becomes a rhythm, a chant, a cry that reverberates across time. The stage transforms his life into a visceral experience, the actors breathing life into his victories and vulnerabilities alike. Every movement, every note, every line spoken is imbued with the weight of history and the vibrancy of storytelling, reminding us that legends live as much in sound and motion as they do in stone and ink. Yet, the interpretations are not confined to adoration or criticism. Many works of art and literature wrestle with the complexities of his character, refusing to reduce him to a single narrative. They depict him as a man shaped by his circumstances, a visionary who saw a future others could not but whose path to that vision was strewn with sacrifice and strife. These stories do not seek to judge him, they seek to understand him. They ask, what does it mean to carry the weight of a kingdom on your shoulders? What price does greatness demand? In the global sphere, Shaka's story takes on new dimensions, his name evoking both fascination and debate. Some international portrayals romanticize his life, painting him as a noble figure who rose against impossible odds. Others sensationalize his reign, amplifying the violence and drama to fit a narrative more palatable to foreign audiences. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies that refuses to be simplified. For the Zulu people, these portrayals can be both a source of pride and a point of contention. They see their history, their culture, their hero being interpreted through lenses that often miss the nuances of his legacy. Yet, they also recognize the power of these stories to keep his memory alive, to ensure that his name echoes far beyond the lands he once ruled. Shaka becomes not just a historical figure but a symbol, a point of connection between the past and the present. And so, the stories continue to evolve, each retelling adding another brushstroke to the canvas of his legacy. Through books, films, songs, and plays, Shaka remains a figure of endless intrigue, his life a wellspring of inspiration and reflection. The question is not who he was, but who he is to each generation that discovers him anew. The myth and the man converge, his spirit woven into the stories we tell about ambition, resilience, and the eternal dance of power and humanity. The wind howls across the vast savanna, stirring the tall grasses that sway like waves on the ocean. In the distance, a figure stands tall, his face resolute, his eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding fire. It is Shaka. Not just the king of the Zulu people, but a symbol of defiance, an emblem of resistance against forces that sought to crush his people and their way of life. His spirit lingers, not in the dust of time, but in the hearts of those who fight for freedom, justice, and the right to stand tall against oppression. For centuries, Shaka's name has echoed in the hearts of those who struggle. He represents something much deeper than the ruler of an African kingdom. He is the living embodiment of resistance against colonialism, an unwavering force against the dehumanization and violence that many nations have faced. His rise from humble beginnings to the head of the mighty Zulu nation is a story of empowerment and of turning the tide against the powers that sought to subjugate and control. What makes Shaka's story resonate so deeply with those who seek freedom is the sheer power of his defiance. He did not bow to the pressures of foreign invaders or internal enemies. He faced challenges that would break lesser men, but instead of crumbling, he forged a path of strength. His military genius, his vision, and his uncompromising will turned him into a force of nature, one that could not be ignored. The very land he fought for, his people, his culture, his heritage, became his battlefield, and he made sure no one could take that from him. In modern struggles for freedom, Shaka's story is a light, a beacon of hope for the oppressed. His resistance to colonization, even before the full force of European imperialism arrived on the continent, has inspired movements in Africa and beyond. From the liberation struggles across southern Africa to the civil rights movements in other parts of the world, his example is a touchstone. His story reminds us that the fight for freedom is not just a matter of might, it is a matter of heart, of will, of knowing that the spirit of a people cannot be crushed. The influence of Shaka's legacy transcends borders and generations. When people rise to challenge the chains that bind them, whether they are fighting for land, rights, or dignity, they often look to his example. His methods, his courage, his unwavering belief in his people's right to exist and thrive become a touchstone for those who feel that the weight of history is pressing down on them. He fought against more than just invaders. He fought against the idea that some people were less deserving of life, of dignity, and of freedom. The story of Shaka is not just a lesson in war, it is a lesson in what it means to resist with everything you have. His battles were not simply military ones, they were spiritual, emotional, and intellectual. He crafted a society built on the belief that the strength of a people lay not just in their ability to fight, but in their unity, their pride, and their ability to defend their culture, their identity, and their very existence. When he rallied his warriors, it wasn't just for land or power, it was for a vision of the world where they, as a people, stood free and proud, unbowed by anyone who sought to break them. In today's world, Shaka's legacy is present in the struggles for justice that continue to unfold across the globe. His name is invoked in protests, in speeches, in movements for land and dignity. Whether it is indigenous communities fighting for their rights, or nations rising to break free from the chains of modern-day oppression, Shaka's example is ever present. His story is a reminder that resistance is more than a physical struggle, it is the preservation of hope, of self-worth, of a belief that no force can break the spirit of a people when they stand together. As Shaka's legend continues to inspire, it becomes clear that his story is about more than just a battle for land. It is about the fight for the soul of a nation. His defiance is not just about overcoming external forces, it is about overcoming the internal forces of fear, self-doubt, and division. He was a king, but he was also a symbol of the strength that lies within each person, the strength to rise above the circumstances of birth, of history, and of chance, to take control of one's destiny. In the modern world, when we hear Shaka's name, we don't just remember the past, we remember the ongoing struggle for freedom. His story isn't static. It lives in the hearts of those who are still fighting, still resisting, still pushing back against forces that seek to oppress, to silence, to diminish. His story is a reminder that freedom isn't a gift, it is something that must be fought for, that must be earned, and that must be defended with every ounce of strength. The spirit of Shaka is alive in the hearts of revolutionaries, in the courage of those who stand up against tyranny, in the hopes of those who believe that no matter how dark the moment may seem, the future belongs to the brave. It is a spirit that cannot be extinguished by time or distance. It is a flame that burns on, lighting the path for others to follow. Shaka's story is not just a legend of the past. It is a living, breathing force that continues to shape the struggles of today and will inspire the struggles of tomorrow. In every corner of the world, whenever someone rises to challenge the status quo, whenever someone fights for a better future, the echo of Shaka's name can be heard. His legacy is not confined to the pages of history, it is carried in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender. His story, his spirit, his resistance, this is what endures, as powerful today as it ever was, lighting the way for all those who dare to dream of a world where freedom is the birthright of every human being. Under the vast African sky, where the earth seems to stretch forever and the sun burns fiercely overhead, a figure commands the attention of all who are near. Shaka's voice rumbles across the plains, like the distant thunder before a storm. His presence demands respect, and his leadership inspires a deep, unshakable loyalty. He stands not just as a king but as a leader, one whose strategies and decisions shaped not only the fate of a kingdom but the legacy of a nation. To understand the force of Shaka's leadership is to uncover lessons that echo through the ages, lessons that continue to resonate with anyone who dares to lead today. Shaka's leadership style was built on the foundation of absolute confidence and an unyielding sense of purpose. He knew that to command the loyalty of his people, he had to demonstrate strength, resilience, and a sharp strategic mind. But his strength wasn't just physical. It lay in his ability to see beyond the present moment and plan for the future, to shape the destiny of his people with every decision. He was a master of anticipation, always thinking several steps ahead, always aware of the movements of his enemies and his allies. In every battle, every negotiation, every policy, he remained focused on one goal, the survival and flourishing of his people. Shaka's approach to leadership was direct and often ruthless, but it was never without purpose. He believed that strength was the cornerstone of leadership, and that weakness, whether in action, in character, or in resolve, could bring ruin. Yet, this wasn't the cold, detached leadership of a tyrant. His methods were brutal at times, yes, but they were always in service of a larger vision. His discipline and focus were infectious, inspiring those around him to give everything they had, to push themselves beyond their limits, to fight for the future he envisioned. In moments of tension, when fear gripped the hearts of his people or his warriors faced certain defeat, it was Shaka's calm, unwavering determination that kept them moving forward. His leadership was about more than commanding an army, it was about igniting something inside those who followed him. A deep belief that they were part of something greater than themselves, a force that could not be defeated, a vision that could not be undone. In this way, he led not only with power but with inspiration, molding a nation of people who would follow him through fire, through blood, and through all manner of adversity. But Shaka's leadership was not only about force, it was also about innovation. In the same way that he adapted his military tactics, he applied his ingenuity to leadership itself. He didn't simply follow the old ways, he forged new paths. He understood that leadership required constant evolution. He reshaped his warriors into a formidable force through rigorous training, teaching them discipline, speed, and unity. He restructured his army's formations, introducing the famous horns of the buffalo strategy, where his warriors surrounded their enemies in a shape that resembled a buffalo's horns, encircling and overwhelming them. It was this innovative approach that turned Shaka's forces into an unstoppable juggernaut, capable of defeating enemies far larger and more powerful. The lessons in leadership that Shaka leaves behind are not confined to the battlefield, however. He knew that a leader must also understand the human heart, the will of the people, and the delicate balance between strength and empathy. He wasn't a distant ruler, isolated in his palace. He knew his people, understood their needs, and often fought alongside them. He made personal sacrifices, which earned him the loyalty of those who served him. He showed them that he was not just a ruler, he was one of them, committed to the survival and prosperity of the entire nation. It was this connection, this deep sense of shared purpose, that made him not just a king, but a force that transcended mere royalty. Yet, Shaka's leadership was also marked by a certain isolation. His willingness to sacrifice anything and everything for his vision, including his relationships and his own happiness, often left him without the companionship and support he needed. He built a kingdom that was powerful, but it was not without its cracks. The very strength that made him so formidable also led to his downfall, his relentless drive, his uncompromising standards, and his unwillingness to tolerate weakness created enemies within his own ranks. It serves as a lesson for any leader today, the need for balance. Leadership requires a vision, yes, but it also requires humility, understanding, and the ability to build bridges, not just walls. In the modern world, Shaka's leadership provides a powerful blueprint for anyone who leads with a cause larger than themselves. The lessons in Shaka's approach are numerous: the value of innovation, the importance of inspiring others to believe in a vision, and the strength that comes from absolute resolve. But perhaps the greatest lesson Shaka offers is the reminder that leadership is not about being untouchable or perfect. It is about being human, understanding the power of unity, the strength of the collective will, and the importance of staying true to one's principles, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Today's leaders can learn much from Shaka's unshakable belief in his people. It was never about himself. It was always about the strength and future of the nation he led. He understood that leadership meant taking the weight of responsibility for the success and failure of everyone under his command. His actions, his sacrifices, and his determination showed that true leadership is about serving those you lead, about lifting them up, and guiding them toward greatness, even at great personal cost. Shaka's legacy lives on not just in the victories he won, but in the leadership principles that continue to inspire. His story is not just one of military conquest, but one of profound lessons for anyone who steps into the role of leader. The strength to lead with vision, the courage to innovate, and the wisdom to balance power with empathy are the marks of true leadership, qualities that can still change the world today. As Shaka's story continues to resonate through history, it reminds us that leadership is not a static quality. It evolves, it adapts, and it grows. And as we look to the leaders of tomorrow, we can look to Shaka as a symbol of what it means to lead with strength, purpose, and an unwavering commitment to the people we serve. Shaka's legacy is both a tapestry of triumph and a sea of contradictions, each thread woven with both reverence and fear. His life has been immortalized in countless myths, but those myths aren't static. They shift with time, twisting and turning to fit the needs of those who tell them. As the generations pass, the stories of Shaka's life, of his fierce leadership, of his brutality, of his vision for a unified nation, are rewritten. These reinterpretations aren't just the musings of historians or storytellers, they're a reflection of the struggles, hopes, and identities of those who retell them. The power of Shaka's myths is undeniable, for they have shaped the very foundation of the Zulu nation. His life, filled with legendary moments and monumental battles, has become the lifeblood of the Zulu identity, a source of pride and strength. But the myths surrounding him, those tales of the unyielding warrior who conquered all in his path, are not as simple as they may seem. They are not just stories told to glorify the past, but rather they are living, breathing symbols that evolve with the needs of the people. In times of crisis, Shaka is remembered as the hero who overcame insurmountable odds. In times of loss, he becomes the symbol of what is possible through strength and determination. Yet, beneath the surface of these myths lies an alternate perspective, one that challenges the glorified image of Shaka as a perfect, untouchable ruler. For some, Shaka's reign is not one of admiration, but of pain. His methods, brutal and unforgiving, left scars on the very people he sought to unite. There are those who see the fierce leader not as a savior but as a tyrant whose relentless pursuit of power led to the destruction of families, the disintegration of old ways, and the sacrifice of countless lives. This alternate view of Shaka is often hidden beneath layers of folklore, but it is there, woven into the stories told by those who suffered under his command. As time moves forward, these new perspectives on Shaka's life begin to shape a more nuanced understanding of the man. He is no longer just the mythical conqueror, the godlike figure whose spirit lives on in every Zulu heart. Instead, he becomes something more complex, human, fallible, a man who, in his quest for greatness, made choices that both lifted his people to unprecedented heights and dragged them into darkness. The contradictions within his life make him more real, more tangible, more relatable to those who live with the consequences of his actions. The reinterpretation of Shaka's life also serves as a tool for the Zulu people to reclaim their history. By reassessing his legacy, they can reshape their narrative, taking control of how their past is remembered and understood. Shaka's life is no longer a story told solely by outsiders, but one that belongs to the Zulu people. It is theirs to redefine, to rewrite, and to share with the world on their own terms. The myths surrounding Shaka no longer serve only the purposes of colonial powers or foreign historians, but become a way for the Zulu to assert their identity, to remember their struggles, and to honor their resilience. And yet, the role of myth in the national consciousness cannot be overstated. Myths have always been more than just stories. They are the vessels through which culture is preserved, through which people find meaning in their history and shape their sense of self. In the case of Shaka, his story has been transformed into more than just the tale of one man's life. It has become a metaphor for the strength of a people, a symbol of unity in the face of adversity. The myth of Shaka, whether one sees him as a hero or a tyrant, serves as a mirror reflecting the values and struggles of the Zulu nation. In moments of hardship, when the nation faces challenges both internal and external, Shaka's myth serves as a reminder that resistance is possible. His image, larger than life, stands as a beacon for those who seek to overcome. And yet, the very same myth, in times of peace and prosperity, may serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition and the dangers of isolation. The myth of Shaka is not static. It grows, evolves, and changes as the needs of the people change. It is not just a part of the past, it is a living, breathing force that shapes the future. For those who embrace the more heroic interpretation of Shaka's life, his story becomes one of national pride, a testament to the power of will, strength, and unity. For others, the darker side of his reign serves as a reminder of the complexities of leadership and the delicate balance between power and humanity. The myths, in this sense, do not offer simple answers. They leave room for reflection, for questioning, and for understanding the full scope of Shaka's legacy. The reinterpretation of Shaka's life isn't just about reassessing a historical figure, it's about understanding how the past shapes the present. It's about the ways in which we, as individuals and as nations, use myth and legend to create meaning and to define who we are. Shaka's story will never be static, for it is a reflection of the people who tell it. As long as the Zulu people remember him, as long as his name is spoken and his deeds are recounted, the myth of Shaka will continue to evolve, continuing to shape not just the past, but the future as well. And in this evolution, we see the power of mythology, not just as a tool for remembering, but as a force that can shape national identity, that can heal wounds, and that can inspire a people to rise once more. Shaka's vision for Africa wasn't just about conquering. It wasn't merely about forging an empire of power and might. It was, at its core, about unity. A dream that, in its time, seemed both impossible and bold. It's a vision that echoes through the ages, its resonance reaching beyond the borders of the Zulu nation, stirring the hearts of those who believe in something greater than themselves. The idea of uniting a continent fractured by tribes, kingdoms, and endless divisions was not just a political ambition, it was a cry for brotherhood that transcended skin color, language, and tradition. Shaka stood on the precipice of a future that many could not even imagine. For him, Africa wasn't a collection of separate nations struggling for dominance. It was a vast and interconnected land, where all tribes could stand together, not as enemies, but as one people. This vision wasn't simply an idealistic fantasy, it was born from the very core of his being, the way he lived, fought, and breathed his belief in strength through unity. His battles weren't just about gaining land, they were about consolidating a fragmented world, about forging a future where different peoples could come together to build something stronger, more lasting. In the stories told about Shaka, there is a deep sense of longing for this unity, a mythological framing of him as a Pan-African visionary. His name is invoked not only in the context of his fierce military prowess, but as a symbol of what Africa could be, one united force, resilient against any external threat. His mission was never about subjugating others for personal gain, but about creating a foundation where African strength could be harnessed through collective will. The divisions between tribes, which had long been a source of conflict, would be erased under his rule, replaced by a shared identity, bound together by their common struggle. To understand Shaka's vision is to understand the deep pain of his time. Africa, like a wounded beast, had long been torn apart by tribal wars and outside forces seeking to exploit its riches. There was a need, more pressing than anything, for change. For something or someone to rise above the chaos and forge a new path. And in Shaka, many saw that beacon of hope. He was the one who could, with his vision, unite the scattered peoples of the land into a force that no enemy could overcome. His ambition was not for personal glory, but for a legacy that would serve generations, lifting Africa out of the darkness of division and into a new era. Yet, like any great vision, Shaka's dream came with its own set of challenges and contradictions. The brutality with which he pursued his vision created as much fear as it did admiration. His methods were often ruthless, his demands harsh, and his reforms unyielding. But even in his harshest moments, there was a tenderness in his hope for what Africa could become, a place where every tribe could hold its place in a greater whole. His ambition was, in many ways, a desperate attempt to save Africa from its own disunity, to create something that could withstand the test of time. As the years passed, the myth of Shaka grew, not just as a king or a conqueror, but as a visionary, a leader whose aspirations reached far beyond his own kingdom. The stories told about him are not just of a man, but of a dream. A dream that, in the eyes of many, has not yet been realized, but still lingers, breathing life into every corner of the continent. The myth of Shaka as a Pan-African hero is one that refuses to fade, kept alive by the hope that, someday, his dream will come true, that someday, Africa will stand united, as one. It is in this mythological framing that Shaka's legacy takes on a new dimension. He is no longer just a historical figure whose life has been reduced to dates and battles. He is a symbol of a future that has not yet been realized, a figure whose vision transcends time. He is remembered not just for the empire he built, but for the dream he had, a dream of an Africa united, not by force, but by a shared vision of what could be. In this way, Shaka's spirit lives on, not as a distant king but as a symbol of what could still be achieved, if only the dream of unity could be realized. As the world watches Africa today, one can't help but feel the weight of Shaka's unfulfilled dream hanging in the air. The divisions between tribes, countries, and ideologies still run deep, but the vision of unity that Shaka imagined continues to inspire. In every movement that seeks to bring people together, whether it is on the African continent or in the African diaspora, there is a whisper of Shaka's name. His legacy, not as a conqueror, but as a visionary, continues to shape the way people see themselves and their place in the world. He stands not as a figure of fear, but as a reminder of what could be, a symbol of hope for those who still believe in the possibility of unity. In many ways, Shaka's vision remains as relevant today as it was in his time. It is a vision that challenges the world to move beyond its differences, to see strength in diversity, and to embrace the idea that, together, people are stronger than they are apart. His story is a testament to the enduring power of vision, a reminder that, even in the face of adversity, one person's dream can spark the fire of change. And so, Shaka's legacy lives on, not in the battles he fought, not in the empire he built, but in the dream he carried, a dream that, even now, calls to us, urging us to look beyond ourselves and see the world as one, united, unbreakable, and free. In the twilight hours, when the world was neither day nor night, the air around the Zulu kingdom was thick with the power of the unseen. The people knew that Shaka wasn't just a king, he was something more. As he walked among them, the earth seemed to tremble, and the winds would whisper his name like an ancient prayer. His presence felt divine, as though the gods themselves had chosen him for a purpose far beyond the ordinary reach of humankind. To the Zulu people, Shaka wasn't merely a mortal ruler. He was a figure woven into the very fabric of their spiritual beliefs, tied to the heavens by an invisible thread. He was seen as a man blessed with extraordinary strength, a vision that stretched beyond the realm of human understanding. And in their hearts, they knew Shaka was not just a king, but a chosen figure, sent by the gods to lead them into a new era. He was a demigod, the living embodiment of their most sacred beliefs. Shaka's connection to the divine was told in the hushed tones of fireside stories, passed from one generation to the next. In these stories, he was not just a conqueror of lands, but a man imbued with supernatural power, a force capable of shaping the fate of nations. He was believed to be the son of the heavens, a being whose birth was foretold by the spirits long before he emerged into the world. The heavens themselves had watched over him from the moment of his conception, guiding him with an unseen hand through the darkness of his early life. The elders, their eyes heavy with the wisdom of years, spoke of how the gods had touched Shaka's life in ways no ordinary man could understand. They would say that his victories in battle weren't just the result of military genius, they were the will of the gods manifesting through him. When Shaka stood in the midst of his warriors, his body moving like a force of nature, they believed it wasn't just his strength they saw. It was divine power flowing through his veins, a gift from the gods that made him unstoppable. The belief that Shaka was chosen by the divine gave his rule an unmatched authority. The people saw in him a king who was not bound by earthly limitations. His decisions were seen as sacred, his every word treated as the will of the heavens. When he spoke, the very earth seemed to listen, and the stars in the sky watched over him like silent guardians. His enemies, too, believed that his victories were not just due to human skill. They feared that fighting Shaka was to battle the gods themselves. To cross him was to face divine retribution. It wasn't just war, it was a cosmic battle of fate. Shaka's link to the divine wasn't just abstract or spiritual, it was deeply rooted in his actions and how the people viewed him. The Zulu warriors would speak of his ability to foresee the future, of how he would predict the movements of his enemies with unsettling accuracy. The idea that he could see beyond what was visible to the human eye made him even more of a divine figure in the eyes of his people. His uncanny intuition and strategic genius made him a leader not only of men but of the forces that governed the world. But even beyond his military successes, there was a deep connection to the divine in how Shaka carried himself, how he lived. He was revered as a man who walked with the gods, a king who understood the spiritual world as intimately as he did the physical. Stories of his fierce discipline and unwavering commitment to his people were framed not only as acts of leadership but as offerings to the gods. His sacrifices, his devotion, his suffering, all of it was seen as an alignment with the divine will. The line between Shaka's humanity and the divine blurred, leaving behind a figure whose power seemed unearthly, whose reign felt like it was part of a greater cosmic plan. His life, his triumphs, and even his tragedies became a myth of their own, a tale of a divine leader whose purpose on earth was far greater than any man could fully comprehend. In this mythological context, Shaka's very existence carried weight beyond mere historical fact. His reign was not just a period of conquest, it was seen as a divine era, an age when the gods walked among the people through him. When Shaka led his people, it wasn't just the strength of his arm or the sharpness of his mind. It was the power of the gods themselves that was behind him. As the years passed and Shaka's rule ended, the stories about him transformed. He became something more than a king. His legacy became entwined with the very spiritual essence of the Zulu nation. The Zulu people began to see him not just as a historical figure, but as a divine presence, a godlike figure whose spirit continued to guide them. Even in death, Shaka remained tied to the heavens, his memory living on in the whispers of the wind and the rustle of the trees. The stories of Shaka's divine nature didn't fade with time. They lived on in the songs and dances of the Zulu people. His name, once spoken with reverence in the halls of his royal palace, became a symbol of divine power. Every act of courage, every battle fought, every victory won was viewed as a testament to his divine connection. Even when people faced hardship or strife, they would call upon Shaka's name, knowing that his spirit was still watching over them, guiding them through the darkness. Through the lens of Zulu spirituality, Shaka's legacy was not just about the empires he built or the lands he conquered. It was about his profound connection to the divine, a connection that gave his reign an aura of sacredness. In the myths of Shaka, he transcended the role of a mere ruler. He became a divine figure, a protector, a leader sent by the gods themselves to guide his people toward greatness. Even in the face of adversity, his spirit was seen as a source of strength, a reminder of the power that comes when the heavens align with the will of a leader. The stories of Shaka's divine nature remain alive today, not just in the past, but in the hearts of those who still believe in the power of the unseen, and the strength that comes from a connection to something greater than ourselves. The sun sets, casting long shadows over the rolling hills where once the thunder of battle had echoed. The earth, now quiet, whispers a name that has not been forgotten. Shaka. The king who, with a single step, could shift the balance of entire nations. His reign, his wars, his victories, they live on, not just in the records of history, but in the stories that have woven themselves into the very heart of the land. It's almost as though his spirit still walks among the people, his shadow lingering just beyond the horizon. The world has changed since his time, yet Shaka's name remains a powerful force. His story, a mix of truth and myth, has become something more than just the past. It is alive, breathing through the generations, carried in the whispers of old tales, and the steady rhythm of drums, and the songs sung by those who still honor his name. He may have passed from this world long ago, but through legend, Shaka has become immortal. Each telling of his story brings new layers, new meanings. Some say he was a fierce leader, his ambition unyielding, his strength unmatched. Others paint him as a god, chosen by the heavens to lead his people through darkness into greatness. The line between history and myth is thin, blurred by time, and yet it is this very blending that has kept his legacy alive. What is it that makes a person live on after death? What is it that turns a man into a myth, a king into a legend? Perhaps it is the way he changed the world, the way he shaped history with his vision. But maybe it's more than that. Perhaps immortality is born from the stories that endure, from the hearts that still beat to the rhythm of his name. When a story is passed down through generations, it doesn't fade. It grows, it adapts, and it survives. Shaka's legacy has woven itself into the fabric of African history, becoming part of the soul of the continent. And yet, the reality of Shaka's life was not all grandeur or glory. His was a path filled with violence, sacrifice, and heartache. The man behind the myth, complicated, flawed, has often been overshadowed by the grandeur of his legend. But that, too, is part of his immortality. The fact that his story doesn't follow the neat lines of history, but instead dances in the spaces between truth and myth, is what keeps it alive. It's what makes him more than just a man from the past. It makes him a figure who transcends time. In the silence of the night, when the wind rustles through the trees, one can almost hear the whispers of his people, recounting his deeds, recounting the legend that has carried his name through the ages. Even as the world has moved on, even as time has claimed so much, Shaka's story endures. The power of his name still ignites passions, still evokes the same fire that once burned in his warriors. Perhaps it is because his life was one of such magnitude, one filled with both triumph and tragedy, that it resonates so deeply with those who hear his story. Shaka was not a perfect man, and his empire was not flawless. But he represented something greater than himself. He was the embodiment of strength, of vision, of a belief that no obstacle was insurmountable. It is this belief, this unwavering confidence, that has allowed his story to echo down through the years. He was a king who saw the potential for greatness in his people, a king who would stop at nothing to achieve his vision. His drive, his ambition, and his willingness to sacrifice all for his dreams are what make him stand out. His story is not one of simple conquest, it is one of vision, of resilience, and of the lengths to which a leader will go to bring his people together. This, in itself, is what has kept him alive. This is what gives him immortality, not just the victories he won, but the people he inspired, the legacy he left behind. It's in the quiet moments that his legend feels the strongest. When the world slows down, when the noise of modern life fades, one can almost hear the echoes of his voice, calling out from the past. The tales of Shaka do not belong only to the past, they are woven into the very present, alive in the hearts of those who still remember him. His story is shared in hushed whispers, in the proud declarations of his warriors, and the songs sung by his people. Through them, his spirit lives on. The stories of Shaka are not always kind. They are filled with pain, with loss, and with the sacrifices that come with power. Yet it is this complexity, this raw, untamed essence of his life, that makes his myth even more powerful. He is not the flawless hero of traditional stories, he is something deeper, something that resonates with the human condition. He embodies the strength and the darkness that lives within us all. He is a reminder that greatness is not without its cost. And perhaps that is the true meaning of immortality. Not that we live forever in the physical sense, but that our stories, our legacies, live on in the hearts and minds of others. Shaka's life, his power, his vision, these are the things that endure. His story is passed from one generation to the next, not because it is flawless, but because it speaks to something in each of us. It speaks to our desire for greatness, our yearning for meaning, our search for something larger than ourselves. The legend of Shaka continues to evolve. It grows with each retelling, taking on new dimensions, reflecting the struggles and triumphs of the people who remember him. In the hearts of those who carry his name, Shaka will never die. He will remain as he always has, immortal, timeless, a symbol of the strength and spirit that lives within every person who dares to dream of greatness.